There was absolute silence in the forest. You could hear every sound in the blink of the leaves. It seemed like there wasn't a single living soul in this forest. On one of the branches in this forest sat a common magpie. It was the only one that made sounds in this forest. Looked from side to side, it seemed to her that danger was approaching. Therefore, she immediately decided to change her location. Flapping her wings, she took off. Mai decided to fly to a safer place somewhere further into the mountains. She was frightened by the steps that were getting closer and closer. It was a young man who was alone in the forest. All these events took place in Kazakhstan, in the mountainous part of this country. The young man had a map in his hands. On it was marked the place where he was supposed to go. He stood for a while and looked at this map to make sure he was on the right path. Already closer to the evening, the young man got to a small village in the mountains where he met a local resident. The young man asked if he was in the right place. A local resident told him that he was in the right place and pointed out the house he was looking for. This house was a little separate from the rest of the village. The young man was in a hurry because he had come a long way. As a girl, she sat by the window waiting for a miracle in this life. All she had left were memories. She sat at the table and looked at the photographs she had left near the open window as always. These photographs and inscriptions that she had were the only memory she had of her family. The young man had almost reached this house. On the one hand, he wanted to get inside as quickly as possible to achieve his goal. While on the other hand, he was worried that everything would be as he wanted. He was afraid of disappointment. Come closer to the front door of this house, he knocked. After waiting a few minutes without hearing an answer, he knocked again. After which, he decided that he should go inside and he extended his hand to open the door. The young man very slowly opened the door, waiting to see what he would see. After which he immediately took a step forward because he came here precisely to do this. The girl turned her head and looked at the young man with an ambiguous expression. She didn't understand what was happening. The young man looked at her and asked Seo-jin. The girl looked at him and said nothing. After which the young man decided to take off his hood. Maybe this way she would be able to recognize him. Why did he say that they finally met after many years of separation? At that moment, when he took off his hood, the girl was so surprised she saw this young man and understood that she also wanted this debt. She immediately recognized him because it was her brother. She was filled with feelings because he was the most precious person to her. They stood there for a while looking at each other and couldn't say a word. The pages of the book that lay in front of her began to turn over in the wind. What was written there? It was all for the sake of dragging his only sister. There were photographs in his notes. It was the story of one killer. And if we say correctly, it was the story of one killer who chose the path of Asura. It was the story of a young man who chose the path of war or the fight for his existence. This is the story of a young man who was left completely alone and had no choice but to learn to protect himself, and also learn to take revenge on all his offenders and all those who brought evil into his life. He learned to survive despite all the ups and downs he encountered. In fact, his whole life was a series of deprivations of his memories, and there was nothing joyful or good. It all started at the very moment when he first lost his parents. Then he was put in prison and he thought that his life was over. He didn't understand how it happened that first one thing was taken away from him and then another, and ultimately his freedom was taken away from him. It was very hard for him, and he didn't understand what to do, but somewhere deep in his soul, he thought that he needed to survive. While in this prison, he did not understand how long he and his sister would be in this place. So day after day passed. The young man was in despair. I don't understand what will happen to them next. One morning, he heard some kind of sound from the other side of the bars and he raised his head. It was then that he saw two guys. One of them sat down to look at his sister. This guy was very surprised because he realized that his sister was an albino. The young man tried to cover for his sister. He was very worried about her, that this was the only thing he had left from his family. These two standing on the other side of the bars said that they would take this girl today. The young man was simply in despair. He did not know what to do. He was filled with anger and hatred towards these people. When one of the guards entered, the young man shouted that if he took another step forward and even tried to touch her, he would definitely kill him. The guard didn't listen to his insults for long. He swung his leg and struck the young man right in the chest, after which he staggered and fell. The guard told the young man that he still didn't understand what was happening. The guy tried to cough after being hit, after which the guards kicked the young man in the chest several more times with all their might. He told him that he wanted to see how he would finish him off and whether he could repeat what he said. The girl was very upset. She rushed to help her brother. She was very worried about him. The guard didn't think long before he swung his leg and kicked the girl right in the face. The second guard told him to hit her lighter because he could ruin her body. Then the guard leaned over and told the guy not to worry because his little sister was going to a good place. The young man looked at the guard. He couldn't answer him. He hated him more than anything in the world. The guard looked at him and told the second one to look at this guy's gaze. After which the guard grabbed him by the sea and struck him several more times. The guard ordered him to answer or he would kill him right here. The guy grabbed his hand and sent him. The young man gathered all the strength that was in him and sent him very far away. After which he spat in the direction of this guard right in his face. The guard threw the young man aside so that he fell to the ground. The man came in and took a napkin out of his pocket and wiped his face. He was very angry at this guy. He ordered the second guard to take this girl, and he was ready to teach this guy a lesson so that he would remember it for the rest of his life. The guard grabbed the girl by the hand and started to pull her. At that moment, she screamed for him to let her go. The guard grabbed her, put her on his shoulder, and started to carry her away. The girl tried to grab her brother, but it was too late. The young man was in despair. He didn't know what to do or how to help his sister. He shouted to her, "Only Gina." The second guard who stayed told the young man to take better care of himself, at which point he raised his leg to hit the guy. The evil with which the young man looked at this guard was much greater than the pain he felt. 2 years later, his life had changed almost nothing during this time. A bucket of water was poured on him to bring him to his senses. The young man was lying on the floor. It seemed like he was barely breathing. It was unclear whether he was already dead or still alive. Now he had nothing left but his own life. The people who stood on the other side of the bars where he was were talking about how they thought they couldn't use him and that 2 years had passed and it was better to get rid of him. He was practically unconscious, but his eyes were still open. The next moment, his eyes closed. At that moment, he could lose the only thing he had left, this life. While in the cell, he heard screams coming from outside. He heard that they were being attacked. The young man tried to open his eyes and see what was happening around him. He could only see that someone hit the guard hard, and that guard fell to the ground. The young man did not understand what was happening. He sat silently. He did not even have the strength to get up. Someone approached his cell and asked through the iron bars if he was dead. The young man lifted his head and looked up, and then this man saw that he was alive. Finally, they came for him and called him out of this hell. He saw that the door of his cell opened, and in front of him was a man. His face was all covered in blood. The man extended his hand to the young man and told him to get up. The young man, when he saw his face and the fact that it was the man holding out his hand to him, realized that this was his chance for salvation. He grabbed his hand and tried to get up, but he didn't have the strength to do it. His savior turned out to be some unknown man. He freed him from the cell and took him with him. Why did they go together to the place where this man was? The man said his name was Kim Shin, and he explained that he was wandering along the Heilongjiang River with his teacher and was training. It was at this moment, by a lucky chance, that he came across him, that is, the camp where the young man was located, after which he freed him. Time passed very quickly, and the young man did not have time to look back as he was already attached to them and was training with them. When the young man was already completely in Vixa with a new way of life, Kim Shin suddenly left him. After some time, one of the people accidentally stumbled upon his savior and recognized him. In a conversation between them, it turned out that his savior Kim Shin had become a killer during this time. They went together to fights without rules, where the fight continued until the moment when one fighter did not kill the other. In these fights without rules, only the strongest could survive, only the one who could be called a killer. They stood together and watched everything that happened in the ring. The young man asked his savior why he became a killer because, in fact, he thought he was a good person. Kim Shin thought for a while and then he answered the young man. He became a killer only to get what he wanted. Then the young man asked him if he could become a killer and whether he would be able to get back what was taken from him. Kim Shin explained to the young man that everything depends on the food and that it will be as she wants it to be. And then he added that one way or another, she always returns to the person, so most likely he will be able to get what he wants. After which they turned around and each went in his own direction. The young man looked after his savior for some time. At that moment, Kim Shin stopped. He had something else to say to this guy. Without turning his head, he told the young man that there was, however, something he had to understand. If there is something for which he is ready to risk everything he has, and he is not afraid of losing it, then he needs to become a killer. After which he very quickly began to leave. He thought for a bit, weighed everything up again, and remembered the words of his savior. He decided that he really needed to become a killer. Becoming a killer was not easy at all. It was daily training and sparring with the enemy. But despite all this, he endured. He was ready to endure everything in order to become what he wanted to become. Therefore, he did not spare himself at all, and he trained almost the whole day, leaving little time for sleep. He couldn't let anything be taken away from him again. He couldn't let himself be weak. Moreover, he understood that he needed to return what was taken from him at some point. A young man stood in the rain in the night city. In his hands was a huge dagger. He could not stop. And so he went forward despite the weather and other obstacles. It was then that he chose this path for himself, the path of Asura. He was ready for any struggle for his existence. A year later, people who were ready to accept him into the team of killers came to see him. They noticed that he had really changed a lot over the past year, and Tigro deserves credit for that. The young man stood in front of them. His white sneakers were covered in blood, despite the fact that it had just rained. He looked at his employers and waited for an answer from them. He had done a lot of work to achieve his goal. The man looked at the girl and saw her beautiful face. At that moment, he thought only about his sister. This girl said that she congratulates the young man on joining their team. The young man stood in front of them. His face and all his clothes were covered in blood. He had daggers in his hands. That's when he was nicknamed Magpie. That's when he became a killer. A few years later, he decided to deal with those offenders who tried to take away the last thing he had, his life. He found those same guards and beat them up. The guards didn't understand why they were being treated like that. They wanted to know who he was and why he was treating them this way. The young man looked at the guard. He was even a little offended that he didn't recognize him, after which he dealt with these two guards, killing them. Then he went up to the third one and said, "Does he really not remember who he is, holding a dagger over his head?" At that moment, the guard remembered that look, because he had seen it a long time ago, but he did not expect to meet this guy alive. This time, the young man looked completely different. He told the guard that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and now his time had come. The young man wanted to find out only one thing from this guard, where he sold his sister. Otherwise, he would simply kill him. The guard couldn't remember what he was talking about. The young man then asked him again where he had sold his younger sister. The guard began to remember that there really was a girl, and she was an albino. The guard said that several years had passed and he could not know where she was now. Having not received a clear answer, the young man understood that he had no choice but to punish this guard as well as the others. But he needed to know where his sister was. The young man swung and hit the guard in the chest just like he had once hit him. Then he grabbed the guard by the hair and pulled his head up. At that moment, he said that he still didn't understand what was happening exactly. Those words that he said to him then. After which he threw his head to the side and held it. He wanted to look this guard straight in the face. The man told the guard that if he didn't answer all his questions now, he would kill him right here. The guard had no choice but to speak. He said the name Gon. After which the young man hit him in the face so that Lisa went through his entire face and blood splashed in all directions. And then the man said that he was going to put blades in his neck if he didn't tell everything properly. Almost unconscious, the guard began to say that Hong Kong was the place where his sister was taken. The young man asked him again. He was sure that it was Hong Kong when they took his sister away. He said that this was enough for him. The guard put on after he named the place where his sister is, then he will leave him alive. Well, his hope was unjustified. The next moment he was stabbed with one dagger. The guard couldn't hold back and blood started to fall. It sprayed from him in different directions. Everything was covered in blood. The young man turned sharply in the opposite direction. He had nothing more to do here. Everything he could find out from these people he found out, and as soon as he could punish them, he punished them. He went in search of his sister from this place for a day. There was a huge shadow, and it was all made of blood. He held a huge dagger in his hands, and in front of him was a guy hanging upside down. The young man in the light suit stood and held this dagger. He needed to make a decision. These cover-ups took place in China, in Guangzhou. On both sides stood subordinates. Their master stood in the middle and held a dagger in his hands. He had to prove the guy who was hung by his legs. One of the servants asked Mr. Ryukai to stop, but he didn't even turn around. Then this subordinate added that all preparations on the Hong Kong side had been completed. Ryukai approached this guy who was suspended and who became in pain. He said that it was very good. Then Ryukai's lock came down with all his might to strike the guy who was hanging by his legs. When the blow was delivered, it sprayed in all directions. This guy received punishment from the hands of Ryukai. The blood seemed to be everywhere. The whole floor was covered in his blood. One of the servants handed the owner some towels so that he could wipe off the blood. Ryukai took these towels in his hands and wiped them because they were really all covered in blood, and noted that it was time for them to start. After which, he threw away this bloody towel, attacked, and did not pay attention to the fact that his jacket was also covered in blood. He went on. He was ready to implement a plan to become the owner of the entire continent. At the same time, in another part of Hong Kong, at the Triad headquarters, they gathered to resolve one of the most important issues of the moment. There was a cup of hot drink that had just been brought in on the table. He reached out his hand to take the cup and take a sip from it. He needed it to think, so he took a few more sips before putting the cup on the table. There were two people sitting at the table opposite each other while he was drinking his drink. There was complete silence. One of them was the current head of the triad, Liu Wanshen. He asked his interlocutor how the preparations were going. His interlocutor sat and remained silent for some time, thinking about how to answer him. His interlocutor was Liu Wen, the successor to the head of the triad. Putting the cup on the table, he replied that everything was going according to plan. The current head of the triad looked at the young man and told him that very influential people were watching him, and not the slightest detail should be missed. The young man took every word of the current head very seriously, and he answered that they could trust him. Then the young man reached out his hand to take the teapot and pour himself some more tea, at which point he said that, by the way, pouring tea into his cup, he began to say that regarding the conversation they had the other day. Liu Wen poured tea into his cup very slowly. He first of all wanted to know what the current head would do about it. The receiver wanted to know what the current head thinks about Ryukai and how he behaves. Liu Wanshell was not quite ready for this conversation, and he did not know what to answer him. So after thinking for a bit, he started to get up from the table. At this time he said that it didn't matter how rotten the child was. After which the current head turned around and started to leave, and then he added that this child still remains part of the family. When Liu Wen heard this answer, he immediately jumped up from his seat and shouted to his father. His father didn't even turn around. He answered him that if he fails to complete his task, he will lose face in front of the elders, so he needs to focus on the process of succession. Then he turned his head, looked at his son, and said that he would deal with Ryukai himself. Liu Wen didn't like this answer very much. He couldn't be angry with his father, so he clenched his fists. After which he lowered his head, bowed, and said that he completely agreed with his boss. Hong Kong is a huge city where modernity and customs intertwine. As in any large city, there were many bright advertising signs and a lot of transport that created traffic jams. At the same time, a plane landed at the airport of this city. It was on this plane that the young man arrived. He had a small backpack on his shoulders as part of his luggage. When he left the airport building, he wanted to look around to understand where he should go next. The first thing he saw was a lot of cars driving past him on the highway. At the wheel of one of these cars sat a girl who found out that she needed to meet him. She screamed very loudly, "Magpie, is this really the same Magpie?" Lisa, the same blonde who helped him become a killer, believed that he was uncontrollable. Moreover, he had a personal relationship to this case. Lisa was telling her partner from Hong Kong that this guy is still green, but they need a person like him. Magpie will be a valuable resource for them if they can channel it in the right direction. The girl who was driving, she listened attentively to every word of her partner, and she understood that the situation in Hong Kong was not very good. She just wanted to know that he was warned that he should not overdo it. She believed that the main thing was to manage this boy correctly. The girl from Hong Kong said that Lisa knew perfectly well that the management would not be able to cover for him. Lisa listened to her attentively and said that it was time for her to go. She was counting on her partner, Marina. Marina still wanted to find out something from Lisa, but she hung up. So the girl was very upset. She was in a hurry to meet Soroka. Her sports car was driving along the highway at a very high speed. She had to meet him as soon as possible. At this time, the young man, after leaving the airport, sat down on a bench near the parking lot and looked at the night city. He really liked this view, so he wanted to enjoy this experience. Fedya was on the bench. He was thinking that this city was pretty nice, and in his opinion, he should like it here. The young man turned his attention to the car that had stopped right next to him. He didn't show it. He wanted to know what kind of car it was and why it stopped in front of him. The driver of this car did not turn it off. He just stood in front of it for a few more minutes, after which the driver's door of this car opened and the driver began to get out of it. After he got out of the car, he walked towards the young man. He obviously stopped and looked at him. Come closer to the young man, he said that Soroka actually looks much younger than she thought. The drivers of this car were Marina, nicknamed a poisonous reptile in East Asia. She was an informant. She asked the guy if he really was Magpie. The young man was a man of few words. He didn't really like talking to anyone. When they got into the car and drove off, the girl tried to say that she had already heard about him. Then she asked the young man because he had come here to find his sister. Soroka sat looking out the window. He didn't want to talk to her at all, so the girl nodded her head so that he would understand her, because of course they can't help with many questions that have a personal relationship with him. Soroka listened to her to the end and said that he of course understood everything. They continued to drive very quickly along the highway. Marina looked at the young man, turning her eyes in his direction. Then she said, "So he knows and he heard from Lisa that things in Hong Kong are not going well." The young man looked at her questioningly. At that moment, the girl shouted, "Doesn't he know? And does he really know nothing?" Soroka looked at her and said he didn't understand what was going on. He wanted an explanation from her. Marina calmed down a bit and said that of course he knows who the Triad are. The young man replied that of course he had heard. Hong Kong is, you could say, the headquarters of the Triad. They have absolute power here. The worst thing is that the current boss of the Triad is now out of work. His son, who is his successor, is going to replace him. Then Marina added that this is why the Triad will do everything to maintain order in this city. The young man asked, and what did he get from all this information? The girl got angry and shouted that he should not bring trouble upon himself. At that moment, she braked sharply so that the sound of tires rubbing against the asphalt could be heard. Marina told the young man to try not to make life difficult for other people. Soroka raised his two hands up and stretched. It seemed as if the words she was saying did not concern him at all. After which he lowered his hands and said that he understood everything perfectly and did not need to be repeated several times. And then look around, he asked where they were. Now the girl answered him that he had come to look for his little sister. She wanted to introduce him to one person. This man was an informant and he works all over the city. His name is Zhuo Wuxing. The young man looked at the girl and asked her. She told him that she couldn't help him, so why was she doing this? Did she really have a crush on him? Marina answered him. He must have gotten something mixed up. She was helping him so that he could get out of this city as soon as possible. The young man turned his head back the other way and said that he pretended to believe the girl answered him that he could do as he wanted in any case. Her help would end there and then he was on his own. Soroka told her that it was too weak to help. The girl answered him that he should say thank you even for this. The young man extended his hand to open the door of this car. He put his foot on the asphalt and started to get out of the car. The girl followed him and told him to get it into his head that this is not Russia and he should not let his guard down. When the young man got out of the car and closed the door for himself, he already understood everything. After which he lowered his head, saluted her and said that they would see each other again. At that moment, Marina thought that she shouldn't have brought him to this place, but it was too late. After which she pressed the gas pedal and moved off very quickly. The young man looked after her. He was left alone in the middle of this city, but he was not at all confused. He needed to act according to his plan. So he turned around and headed to the place he was told to find the informant. The young man headed to the very place where the informant he wanted to talk to was supposed to be. He saw a picture that was incomprehensible to him. One of the guys from whom they wanted something was asking his offenders who they were. These guys in jackets wanted to know why the hell he was following them, to which he replied that he was just an informant. The young man took a few steps forward and asked him if he was Zhuo Wuxing. Everyone was a little surprised. The informant also looked at Soroka. He, like everyone else, wanted to know who he was. The young man said that Marina promised him that he would be able to find a man for him. Wuxing did not deny it, but said that he could not do it due to the specific situation he was in now. At that moment, he was pulled aside and the informant said that he was a little busy. The guys in suits hit the informant and then threw him to the floor. One of the guys in the suit turned his head, looked at the young man and called him. He wanted to ask the young man if he knew this idiot who was now lying on the floor. Soroka answered these guys in a suit that no, he doesn't know him. Then the guys in suits told him to join where he was going if he didn't want to die right now. Soroka tell him that he doesn't understand what to do because he actually has business with this man who is now lying on the floor and he is not going to leave here without completing this business. The man in the suit swung his arm to hit Soroka. He said that he had no business and that he should get out of this place as quickly as possible. After which he struck his blow, but he missed the man's suit and became even more angry. After such actions, the very same dagger that he never parted with appeared in the hands of the young man. He landed several punches on this guy in a suit so that he didn't even have time to react and moved on. The informant and the second guy in the suit were a little shocked. They froze in anticipation of what would happen next. The tide in the suit also didn't know what to do, but he thought that he could still deal with this young man. Soroka, without thinking twice, said that they should simply forgive him, of course, for the fact that he behaves like that. But in fact, he is not going to sort things out with them. He is just in a hurry. Magpie stood holding his huge one in his hands, holding it from the tip of which blood was flowing. He once again told the people who were in front of him that he was in a hurry, so he had to find out something. The informant was simply in shock. He did not understand whether he had really killed this guy. The guy in the suit jerked the informant very sharply and lifted him off the floor to cover himself with him. He understood perfectly well that the guy who stood against them was not so simple. So he presented the informant with a knife to his throat. The guy in the suit wanted to know who he was and why he was here because his hand didn't shake at all when he killed. The young man answered them that he had already said that he had business with this person and pointed to the informant. The man in the suit knew perfectly well that he was not just some amateur. This guy was a real professional. The man in the suit asked if he was in cahoots with him, And he continued to hold his knife near the informant's throat. The young man answered him that for a man who would soon die, he was talking too much. The informant turned his head and looked at the man who was holding him hostage. This man thought that the young man was most likely some kind of foreigner, and he did not understand their laws at all. In any case, he needed to somehow sort out the current situation. That's why this man said that he doesn't know what's going on, but apparently he needs this informant, and it would be very sad if this person died immediately. The informant told the young man that this man was right, and he should listen to him. He didn't know what was wrong with him there, but he was sure it would wait until tomorrow. The young man stood and looked at the two who were clearly afraid for their lives. After which he turned around and went the other way. He said that of course he could come tomorrow. The man in the suit, I said that this was the best decision he could hear today, but the young man added that he did not know what to do. After which he turned around sharply and threw his knife at the man in the suit. It hit him right in the face so that it sprayed in all directions, and he began to fall backwards. He hit the man right in the head. The informant froze in one position. He was afraid to even turn around. Soroka said that he had already told them that he was in a hurry. The informant continued to sit on the floor. He was afraid to make any movement or say any word, after which he took a cigarette and lit it to find out what business this guy had with him. After listening to this guy to the end, he said that it turns out he is an ordinary killer from Russia. The young man did not deny anything. He shook his head. He was not very verbose. The informant told him that even if he kills people for money, he needs to be careful. The young man didn't understand what he meant. The informant tried to explain to him that the two he killed might be members of a triad. For the young man, it was unexpected that he actually finished off two people of the triad member. The informant tried to explain that in Hong Kong, there are no fools who would cross the path of the largest criminal organization. And then he added that he doesn't know how they do things in Russia, after which he took another drag on his cigarette and exhaled the smoke. Then he threw the cigarette on the floor. The informant said that however here Hong Kong should act differently. The young man was a little upset because Marina told him not to create problems, but he had already ruined everything before he even started. The informant put out the cigarette with one of his feet, which he threw on the floor. He told the young man not to worry. He would help hush it up. Then he went forward. The informant said that, by the way, about the person he is looking for, because he said that he was most likely sold to Hong Kong, the young man confirmed that this is exactly how it was about 5 years ago, and now she is about 21 years old. One of her features is that she is an albino. The informant turned around and looked at the young man. I asked him who she was. Was she really his girlfriend? Soroka answered him that he didn't necessarily need to know. The only thing he had to say was that he could find her. The informant thought for a bit and replied that it would not be easy at all, but knowing her age and such a rare appearance, he could try. And Diamond added that they have a chance, and he will try to do something in the near future. This answer suited the young man just fine. Now he just had to wait. The informant took a step forward, raised his hand up and shouted, "Taxi, fur coat." It drove up. The young man asked the informant, "What about the payment?" The informant approached the taxi, opened the door and began to get in silently. The informant couldn't just answer how much he was willing to take for this service. He thought that he didn't know him at all, but he was willing to watch him. So, opening the back door of the car, the informant said that he would take payment for the service. The young man did not understand what was being discussed, and so asked him what he wanted. The informant said that if he encounters a person he doesn't like, he will contact him in that case. And at this time, he will be looking for a person for him. This is exactly the kind of payment he offered. The informant said that he had to eliminate one person for him in exchange for the service that the informant would find where his person was. After which he said that if he agreed, then first they needed to go to Lan Quan Fong. The magpie asked again what kind of place it was where they were going to go. The informant told him that this is the largest nightlife and entertainment place in Hong Kong, so they will go there first. He explained that if he wanted to find someone, he had to start from this very place, from Lan Kwai Fong. In just a few minutes, they were on site. There were quite a lot of people in the area who came to have fun, specifically on the court. There were many shops there, and the young man stopped in front of one of these shops. He decided that he needed to change his sneakers. He needed to buy new ones. And also, along with the sneakers, he decided to buy himself a bomber jacket and an informant. When he saw the guy, he was very surprised. He even told him that the things he chose suited him. The young man did not understand why he needed to change these things and what relation this had to the informant's case. He was told that it had a huge relation because every detail was important. He explained that in this form, they will not arouse suspicion. People will think that they want to buy something and nothing more. Then they went to one of the discs where they were selling glasses. The informant asked the seller to look at his goods. Then he told them to give him one of these glasses. He is their brother for the young man. The informant approached him and turned to him, handing him the glasses. He told the young man to cover his heavy gaze with these glasses, which was noticeable from afar. The informant extended his hand and gave him the glasses and told him to hold them. The young man did not resist. Make glasses if it is necessary for the matter, then he was ready to wear them. When he put them on, he went to one of the cars to see if these glasses suited him. In fact, he looked pretty good and they suited him. After which they went to the night pub Wildflower. When they arrived, the informant said that they were already there. The informant added that it looks like an ordinary bar, but every girl who is sold in Hong Kong goes through it. When the young man heard this, he immediately tensed up, and this tension was visible from the outside. The informant stopped him and told him to relax and not to act aggressively because they were only there to get information. He tried to explain to him that he should behave naturally. He needed to imagine that they had come here as clients. The informant said that he would take on the hostess, and the young man should take one of the girls. Soroka did not understand what one of the girls meant. Then the informant explained to him that he should talk to someone who works in this bar. She was probably also sold into slavery, so she should know something. When they went inside, they saw that there were many girls on the way who were ready to sell themselves. The informant saw the owner of the club. He raised his hand and shouted to her that they had not seen each other for a long time. The owner of the club was sitting at the table. She turned her head and answered him. "Is he still alive?" Then the informant approached her and told her why she was upset with him and why she was upsetting him. The girl got up from the table and asked him to leave her alone because she had enough to do without him. The informant stood up and told her that it was enough to be offended at him because he was not guilty of anything at all. Then he said that he came here for a drink and pointed his finger at the young man. The girl stopped, looked at the informant, and asked him again if he was serious. The informant came closer to her and told her to give him the most expensive drink. His other one needs a better girl. The owner of this establishment asked the informant to take his hands off her. The informant told her that she was being rude today. Then he turned his head and looked at the young man and pointed with his finger where to go. Soroka exhaled. He understood that he needed to act according to the plan that the informant had suggested. He walked up to one of the knocks and sat down on the sofa, turning his head to look around. He was thinking only one thing. Was his sister really sold to this place where there are many men and girls are a commodity? This thought alone made him feel uneasy, but he was ready to find out everything to the end. He sat and waited to see what would happen next. A girl with a full bottle of booze was moving towards his table. This girl's name was Cho Hong. She was very beautiful and she was happy to see such a guy. When she approached the young man, she put the bottle on the table, hugged him, and said that he was just a handsome man. The young man did not know what to do. Then he remembered the informant's words when they came in that he should act as if he had come to have fun and not to fish out information on his hands. He remembered that the informant told him that he should be relaxed. He had no choice but to follow these words so that everything would be fine. The girl looked at the young man, saw his face, and asked what was wrong with him. She moved even closer to him, pouring alcohol into his glass. The girl asked if he was uncomfortable. The young man told me that she got too close to him, and that's why he felt awkward. Then the girl looked at him and said she could help him relax if he wanted to, of course. The young man looked at her ambiguously, but in fact, we really wanted it. You even had an escort of cars driving along this street. When they arrived at one of these establishments, the driver got out to open the door for their owner. The guards stood on both sides and lowered their heads before the owner was supposed to get out of one of the cars. One of the servants approached the car where the owner was sitting and had to open the car door. First, he lowered his head to the master. In this way, he greeted him. And then he extended his hand to open the door of his car and greet the owner when he got out. Opening the door, he said without raising his head that they were already waiting for the boss. A man emerged from the car whom everyone here considered their boss. It was the dragon of destruction named Gao Lei, the head of the Guangzhou branch of the squad. Oh, at the same time, in the bar where the informant was, he was sitting at the bar and there was a glass of alcohol in front of him. He was sitting with the owner of this establishment. They had known each other for a long time, so they could afford it. The informant poured himself another glass of alcohol and poured some for the owner of the establishment too. The girl did one thing. She told her interlocutor that she was sure that he was not here only because of the drink. The informant didn't tell her anything. He took a sip of his glass and she wanted to know what was going on. Why was he here? As he placed the glass on the bar counter, he asked if her establishment was still accepting girls. The owner of this establishment turned her head and looked at her interlocutor, after which she abruptly put the glass on the bar counter. It seemed that she was ready to break it. She then told her interlocutor that she had already told him many times that she was no longer doing this. He said that it seemed to him that she was back to her old ways and that she was again busy with girls. The owner of the establishment took the bottle herself and poured it into her glass. She took a sip and then told her interlocutor that she was no longer the boss here, so he didn't have to ask her about anything. He was very surprised and didn't understand what was going on. Since when was she not the owner of the establishment here? The girl closed her eyes, exhaled, and said that she had long ago ceased to be the mistress of this establishment. The informant brought his glass up, hit her glass, and asked who was the boss in this establishment now. The girl said that even if she tells him, he most likely doesn't know this person. Head and said that in any case she is clean and is not going to justify herself to him anymore. After which she stood up and started to leave. She said that it was time for her to go. At that moment, the informant said that he was looking for one girl. He pulled a wad of money out of his pocket, put it on a chair, and said that this girl had been sold to Hong Kong about 5 years ago. Then he added that she was about 15 years old at the time and was an albino. The girl stopped and looked at her interlocutor. The informant wanted to find out from her whether she had met this girl before because he was ready to pay the wad of money that was lying on the table. After that, she sat back down next to her friend and said that he came too late. Their new boss got rid of everyone who worked there before. After which the informant moved the wad of money closer to the girl and said that he understood everything because she said that she was going to quit and he was sure that she would need it. Then she thought about it, but she wanted to take that money, so she had to tell him everything. When she took the money, she said that during her entire time working here, she had only had one albino girl. She added that the girl was completely out of control, so she sent her back. The informant thought that they were unlucky because now they don't know where she might be. The girl said that he was indeed right, that she was unlucky. If she had behaved quietly, after which she bent down to get something from the shelf that was under the bar counter. And she took out one of the folders. The girl said that if she didn't have such a character, she would have many clients. Then she pulled out this folder, put it on the bar counter, and said that the guy who came with him was the one looking for this girl. The informant picked up this folder, looked at what was in it, and answered his friend that this is exactly it. She wanted to know who this guy was. This girl's informant carefully read everything that was written in this folder and looked at her photo. Continue reading. He answered her that he doesn't know who this girl's boyfriend is. He didn't introduce himself to him. At the table on the sofa where the young man sat, and his new acquaintance who laid her head on his shoulder, she said that this is how she got here. She told her whole story. Soroka listened attentively, and he replied that now everything was clear to him. The girl asked him not to make such a face. She said that it was not as bad here as it might seem to everyone. He was outraged by her words, which means it's not so bad, because his sister was about the same age as her when she was sold into slavery. At this point, their conversation was interrupted by an informant who approached their table. The girl did not understand why he was behaving this way and asked the young man what he wanted. The informant looked at them and said they were having fun. It seemed to him that the young man even liked it, and he thought that this guy was very fond of women, despite the fact that he said something completely different. The informant handed the young man a photograph and told him to look at it. He wanted to know if this was the girl they were looking for. The young man extended his hand into the hall. He had a photograph. He also hoped that maybe this would be some kind of clue. When he saw the girl in this photo, his eyes seemed to be on fire. It was indeed his sister Gina in the photo, and he was very happy in his heart. At this point, the informant asked how he was feeling and whether he had come to his senses. The young man really came to his senses. He wanted to find out the informant where she was now. At that moment, the young man put a photograph of his sister on the table. The girl who was sitting next to him involuntarily looked at this photograph. When she saw this photo, she said that this is a photo of Gina. The guys looked at the girl. The informant asked if she knew her. The girl said that they were together when she first came here. The young man turned around and asked the girl sitting next to him what she meant. At that moment, someone could be heard entering the establishment. The informant turned his head back. He wanted to see what kind of people were coming inside. In fact, this is the show boss surrounded by a large number of security guards and assistants. One of his assistants said that soon all 9 dragons will arrive in Hong Kong. His boss was very pleased because he believed that everything was really just beginning. People who were in this establishment started to leave it. They didn't want to meet these people. One of these people came up to the table where the young man was sitting with the informant and the girl and said that they were finishing their work and that these people should come next time. The informant thought it would be better not to create problems, so it would really be better for them to leave here. So he told my boyfriend that they were going to leave now. Soroka categorically said no, he was not ready to just leave. The informant approached him and started saying that he had drunk a lot and did not understand what he was doing. They would come next time and he would finish communicating with this girl. Soroka demanded that he let him go. The informant put his arm around the young man's shoulder and began to say that he had allegedly gotten very drunk and had a strong smell of alcohol. The former owner of this establishment greeted Mr. Gao Lei and asked how he had ended up there. At that moment, the informant realized who had arrived at this establishment. Was it really that same Gao Lei? The boss who arrived said that today was a wonderful day, so it would be a sin for him not to have a drink. After which he ordered the former owner to bring him better alcohol, and he grabbed the girl who was with the young man and said that he would take her. The gentleman looked at the chair where the young man and the informant were sitting, and on this table, in addition to a bottle of alcohol and a glass, there was a photograph lying. He pushed the girl aside and went to this table. He wanted to understand what kind of photograph was lying on this table. Taking this photo in his hands, he thought that she was very young, very beautiful. It seems that she was with the white dragon. Then he thought that until that moment he was sure that he had deleted all the data about this girl. The informant, when he was leaving this bar, looked back again and realized that this was the new boss that the owner of this bar was talking about. The young man looked at the informant and asked who the guy was who had entered the establishment and thrown them out. The informant answered that he was also interested in finding out, so they should watch. They remained standing near the entrance to this establishment. They quietly observed everything that was happening inside. The gentleman started shouting what kind of photo it was that he found lying on the table and where it even came from. The girl who was sitting on her knees started talking about how she had recently met with a client. The gentleman asked again, and what was the matter? The girl then said that this client was looking for this girl and he came to this establishment to find her. When this gentleman heard what this girl was saying, he got angry and hit the table with his fist as hard as he could, causing cracks to appear. He started yelling at the former owner of this bar that he had already made it clear to her that she should get rid of all the evidence. The owner replied that she had done so, but it seemed that the client himself had brought this photograph. After which this gentleman grabbed the former mistress and hit her with all his might. The mistress fell to the floor. This gentleman demanded that she tell where those bastards who were looking for this girl were now. No one knew. The girl sitting on the floor said that these two had just recently left this establishment. The gentleman became even more angry and hit her in the jaw with his fist as hard as he could. He demanded that she tell him where these guys were from. She said that she really didn't know anything, that it was the first time she saw them. The gentleman grabbed her by the neck and began to strangle her, demanding that she tell him everything she knows. He told her to answer. The girl said that they were there for the first time and asked to be spared. The next moment, the door of this risk establishment opened inwards and a young man stepped forward. When he entered, the first thing he said to the gentleman who was bullying the girl was that he was just a pig. This gentleman continued to hold the girl by the throat after this quiet insult. He turned his head a little and did not understand what was happening. After all, there was some young guy standing there alone, and he was protected by many bodyguards who were not supposed to let him pass. The informant who remained standing on the street thought that this young man was just crazy and did not understand what he was doing. Soroka went inside and said that it was he who brought this photograph. He was absolutely calm. He continued to hold the girl by the throat. He did not understand what was happening and how this could be. The young man said that the photograph he was holding in his hands was his photograph. And so he must immediately give her Soroka glasses he was not going to open in his gaze. At that moment, the gentleman thought that this was a very serious request, and he pressed his hand even harder on the girl's throat, and she began to choke. After which this gentleman let the girl go. She couldn't even stand on her feet because she could barely breathe. The girl fell to the floor, and the gentleman turned around and asked the young man if it really was him. The gentleman held this photo in his hands and asked the guy why he was looking for this girl. The young man told him in response to shut up and give him back his photo. He didn't want to explain anything to him. The gentleman wanted to hear the answer to his question. He asked again why he was looking for her. Then the guy couldn't stand it and answered him. He wants to know why he's looking. He's ready to answer him because it was his younger sister and he's a huge piece of shit. The young man stood in front of this gentleman and told him that this was his younger sister and he was just a huge piece of shit. The gentleman looked at the guy and thought, could she really be his sister? This couldn't be. He clearly understood that he was told that this girl did not have a single relative left. That's why the gentleman said that he was talking nonsense. He can't be her brother. Then the young man clenched his fists and said that there was only one person talking nonsense here, and that was him. The gentleman took this photograph and began to put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He asked the young man again who he was. And most importantly, why is he looking for this girl? He began to clench his fist to punish this guy. The young man said that he was looking for his sister and did not understand what reason he needed for this. One of this gentleman's guards rushed to defend his master with his fists. The gentleman raised his hand and asked him to stay in his place. At that moment, the young man said that he was now took a few steps forward, wants to ask only one question. How can this gentleman know his sister, and why is he sure that she has no relatives? He spoke to this gentleman and came as close to him as possible. When he finished, he stood right in front of him. The gentleman did not understand what was happening, and he had the feeling that he did not know and was not aware of who they were. Having not heard an answer to his question, the young man said again that it turns out he really is a pig if he can't answer him anything. If he really doesn't understand human speech, the young man was serious about finding out everything this gentleman knows. The informant standing behind the entrance door watched everything that was happening. He thought that this young man was really crazy if he was behaving like that. The magpie demanded that this gentleman tell her everything he knew about his sister. The gentleman could not allow anyone to talk to him in such a volume. He raised his hand, swung it, and wanted to hit the guy with his fist. But his blow reached its target as the young man very quickly dodged this blow. The gentleman thought that this couldn't be. This guy very quickly dodged his blow. The magpie told this gentleman that in addition to problems with his weight, he also had big problems with his eyesight. Then the gentleman thought that this guy was not just some small Sasha. So he bent his fingers in the hall and said that first he was ready to teach him a lesson. The gentleman said that he would first rip out his filthy tongue and was ready to do it. The young man took out his dagger, which he always carried with him, and asked him what he was grunting about. Soroka looked at his opponent and understood that this was just one of many that he could remove in an instant. His opponent was easy to find, so he thought that this young man was just some upstart. The gentleman stood in full readiness. He thought that he could destroy this young upstart with one blow. All the other guardian bodies did not move from their place. They watched what was happening. All this tension and silence was interrupted by a certain phone call. Everyone stopped and looked in the direction from where the sound was coming from. The gentleman turned his head and asked his assistant what this was all about. He held out his phone and began to make excuses. He said that the gentleman was being called by the demonic dragon. Mr. Hall put the phone in his hands. He had to answer this call because it was really important. The gentleman thought what a coincidence. Was this demonic dragon watching him that he called at such a moment? The young man nodded his head and spread his hands. He had no choice but to wait for the end of this conversation. The gentleman opened his phone, pressed the call button and said hello. He heard information. At that moment he looked at the young man and thought that he didn't want this guy to hear this whole conversation. So he turned away himself, and when he heard what they told him, he was a little surprised. The gentleman told his subscriber to deal with him but not to kill him. Even though he wanted the young man not to hear this conversation, he still became a witness to this conversation. The gentleman turned away and tried to talk so that no one could hear what was being said. This conversation was important to him, so he couldn't just give it up. He needed to solve his problems. So he ordered his subordinates to keep an eye on this guy because he is not as simple as he seems at first glance. The guys who were standing there, who were the guards of that same gentleman, were ready to deal with this young man, but they were waiting for an order. The young man couldn't help but laugh because he didn't understand what had happened. He said, "Sir, what is so indecent to do, to just take off and leave in the middle of a conversation? It's very rude." The gentleman talking on the phone moved further and further away from the young man, and he approached the exit. When he was almost at the exit, his conversation could be heard by the informant who was standing behind the door. The gentleman said that in any case, he would do everything that depended on him. Then he added that he had a small problem here, and he was currently working on a solution. On the other hand, he was asked what kind of problem he might have. He was interested in who was looking for the white dragon and whether it was one person or several. The gentleman said that he had no idea. It's just that the person who came for this girl today had her photo. The informant thought that most likely the white dragon is what they call the girl they are looking for. And most likely this is the sister of the young man of that very killer who was in this bar. The informant thought that the situation was becoming much more serious than he even thought. He didn't know what to do. Magpie, surrounded by several of this gentleman's bodyguards who stood and watched him, asked them what they were standing for. The next moment he shouted at them to start attacking. He was ready to engage in battle with them. The informant, watching this whole picture, thought that it wasn't about drinking at all. The boy had no brakes at all. From several sides, bodyguards, unable to restrain themselves, began to attack the young man. He stood calmly. When the first one came up to him trying to hit him, the young man hid his hand so that the guy couldn't hit him, after which he tripped him up and pushed the guy back. The very next moment, this guy in a suit was lying on the floor, and the young man swung to hit him. At that moment, another one of the bodyguards approached him and swung to hit the guy from behind. But Soroka finished off his first opponent lying on the floor and dodged the blow of the second. Without turning around, the young man realized that his opponent was swinging his knife again to stab him from behind. So he reached his leg back to trip him and push him back. At that moment, the young man stood up and the opponent's blow again missed its target. One more movement with his dagger, and the second one was already lying on the floor in a pool of blood. After which the young man felt another one of these bodyguards attacking him from behind. He swung and stabbed one of them in the throat with a knife. After which he dealt another one a fatal blow right to the head so that blood sprayed all over the place and he cut his throat. After which the young man stood on one knee, at which point he expected the others to continue attacking him. But everyone else stood and didn't move. They were afraid to even come close to him. One of the gentleman's assistants wondered who this guy was and why he was in this establishment. After all, in reality, he was not as simple as he looked. The young man stood there. His whole face was covered in someone else's blood. For some time, the young man stood there, not understanding from which side the attack would be made on him. He was ready to repel any. So they see that none of them dares to come closer to him. He jumped up and kicked one of his opponents. He kicked this guy right in the chest so that this guy staggered back. On the other hand, at that moment, another of his opponents began to attack the young man. He swung to stab him with a knife. But despite the fact that Soroka immediately repelled the attack of two, it seemed to him that it was very easy and simple. He grabbed one of the guys by the jacket and threw it to the other side, after which the young man hid behind the body of this guy, and the attacking enemy struck his own. His opponent did not understand how this could happen, because he killed his own. The young man cut the throat of the second enemy, and so he became two less. After which he looked around. He was ready to destroy the remaining ones. Over the next few minutes, he destroyed several more of them, and they were already lying in a pool of blood. After which the young man turned around and saw that only two were left. The rest were all lying on the floor in pools of their own blood. The informant observed everything that was happening, and he understood that there was a huge difference between them. But he saw that this young man in Odnono was killing people, so the difference between them and the head of the cut was reduced. One of these Rez tried to engage the young man. He swung to hit him. Soroka cut his throat with one movement of his dagger and moved on. The young man had only one opponent left. This was his assistant. He was the last one to try to attack him. Swinging and trying to hurt the young man, his attack was repelled. The next minute, the young man held the guy by the throat so that he was suffocating. He pinned him to the wall. He needed to find out information, so the young man asked this assistant who they were. The assistant didn't say anything. He just started insulting him about how he was a fucking bastard. Soroka answered him that his answer was correct, but this answer does not count. He asks again who they are. The informant stood watching everything that was happening and thought that if this continues, the situation will become more and more dangerous. Soroka stood in the middle of this bar. Around him on the ground lay the bodies of the assistant and the guard of the gentleman. Soroka understood that all of these were finished, and now he needed to figure out what to do next. At that moment, he heard someone getting up from the floor and saying that he had to get out of that place as quickly as possible. The young man kicked him in the back and the guy fell and continued to lie there. Soroka looked at this guy and said that he was the only one left. The guy was very scared and he didn't know what to do. The first thing that came to his mind was that he began to beg for mercy from the young man. Soroka explained to him that it would be unfair to his friends, and he couldn't do that. So the next thing he did was he cut his throat and the pool of blood got even bigger from the guy's blood. After which the young man went to the exit. He said that he thought that he would have to extract information from that pig. When Soroka came out of this bar, the informant tried to stop him, but it was all useless. The young man approached the gentleman who was talking on the phone. He said that he would be there soon. At that moment, his conversation with Soroka was very unexpected for the gentleman because he ordered to guard this guy. He turned his head ambiguously. I don't understand what happened and how it could happen that this guy interrupted his conversation. The young man told Mr. Dean that he had left in the middle of a conversation and that this was not the way to do it when he was talking to him. The gentleman was even more surprised, but the young man repeated to him once again where he had gone in the middle of the conversation. I looked at him and asked him discontentedly why he was interrupting when the gentleman was talking on the phone. Then the young man answered him that he had finished off all of his lackeys, and that was obviously why he was now standing in front of him and interrupting his conversation. The gentleman was very surprised that this young guy could really kill all his people. Then he looked to the side and wondered what kind of guy was hanging around near the door of this bar. The young man took another step forward and asked if he was still talking on the phone and still not ready to talk to him. The gentleman on the phone said that it seemed like this guy was a real pain in the ass. And then the man asked him again if he was really talking to a girl and he should wait. These words really hurt the gentleman, and he said in a telephone conversation that he would deal with this guy and also call back. The gentleman had no choice but to end this conversation and close the phone. The person he was talking to didn't understand what was going on and why their conversation was cut off so abruptly. He stood by the window looking at the city at night, and it seemed to him that all this was very suspicious. Then he took a few steps to the side, stopped and thought, could it really be? The only thing that came to his mind was the beginning of a war really planned? This was precisely why their conversation had stopped. At that moment, the young man asked the gentleman if he had finished and if they could continue their conversation. The gentleman looked at the young man and saw that his hands were indeed covered in blood, and he was most likely telling the truth. The magpie told the gentleman that he had some questions for him, so he wanted to hear the answers from him. The gentleman thought that this prey managed to kill his guys in such a rush in time, so he should not be treated with disdain. The gentleman took off his jacket and said that he was very sorry, but he could not help this young man. Then he grabbed his head and said that today he would not get a single answer from him. The young man was very determined, so he was ready to attack him. He asked if it was true. If he doesn't give him a real answer, he's ready to listen to his pig squealing. He stood ready to attack the young man. He couldn't allow this guy to point at him like that. The young man struck one blow, but the gentleman very quickly dodged the blow. Despite the fact that the young man did not achieve his goal, he said that the gentleman was very agile despite the fact that he was an ordinary pig. The young man did not stop. He took a step forward and swung the knife again, trying to attack his opponent. Despite the fact that it seemed his opponent was very close, he managed to avoid this blow, after which the young man turned his knife over in his hand to cut from the other side. Soroka took a step forward, struck and stepped away from his opponent. Blood spurted out. The gentleman was injured. Blood was pouring from one of his hands. The gentleman did not notice this, so he continued to tease his opponent and move from side to side. The young man noticed that he had wounded his opponent, so he asked him how he felt about that. At that moment, the gentleman thought that the speed of his attack was very high, and it really surprised the gentleman. In fact, I didn't even have time to notice the wound until I saw the blood spraying everywhere. But despite this, the gentleman shook his huge fist, on which his clean watch was worn, and swung to strike the young man. At that moment, the young man dodged the blow and inflicted another wound on the gentleman's hand. The blood spurted out with even greater force. The gentleman tried to strike, but he couldn't do anything. Despite the fact that he was attacking, the young man very quickly dodged his blows, but inflicted defeats on him. With another such blow from the gentleman, it turned out that he was able to reach this young man, but his hand with the knife went all over his body. The gentleman made the young man fall back and hit the wall. Taking a few steps back, the young man really felt that there was a wall behind him, and he had nowhere to move. Magpie thought that he needed to do something very quickly, otherwise this gentleman would be able to hit him. The gentleman swung and tried to strike. At that moment, the young man ducked and dodged the blow, and the gentleman struck the glass display case, breaking it and sending shards flying in all directions. The speed of the young man's movement was very high. He immediately stuck, then turned over, and then he found himself in another part of the room. By the time the gentleman turned his head, the young man was far enough away that he could no longer reach him. So the gentleman told his opponent that he was running like a rat, trying to provoke him even more. The young man thought that this gentleman was not so easy. He could attack without stopping. It was a very interesting technique. He also thought that their fight could take too much time, and he didn't have that time. So he decided that he should speed up, and he would start using not one knife but two at once. The young man saw before him an enemy that had to be destroyed at any cost, and before destroying it, he had to obtain all the information. He thought of only one thing, that he needed to finish everything as soon as possible, so he rushed to attack him again. Sir, despite the fact that the young man began to attack him, he also decided to attack him in response. Their attacks were mutual, and each of them avoided the attack of his opponent. The young man tried to strike with a knife after a strike. He was trying to find a position from which he could deliver a fatal blow to this enemy. At some point, he thought that it was already possible. He locked himself in order to strike him from above. And he succeeded when he struck this blow. Blood spurted in all directions, but his opponent was the same. The young man thought that this was very good, and his opponent had most likely already been caught. Mr. Pitas swung and struck at his opponent, but the young man kept dodging his blows. After one of these blows, when he found, he jumped up and did a flip to get into a better position. When he was in the air, he realized that something was wrong and his opponent was able to reach him. The gentleman was able to grab him and throw him aside. At that moment, the young man managed to group himself and fall so as not to get hurt. After he fell, it seemed that he would no longer be able to get up. He could barely raise his head. It seemed that this was already the end. The informant stood and watched everything from the side. He thought that this gentleman was really very strong and also had good fighting technique. It seemed that only the young man was carrying out the attack. Well, in reality, it wasn't like that, and this big guy was simply avoiding a critical attack and making his opponent impatient. In fact, he intentionally opened up on one side to attack. That's exactly how it happened the last time he got injured, after which he grabbed the young man and hit him. The informant thought it would be very interesting to watch a killer with 2 daggers and a thug who confronts him with his bare hands. It really was an incredible couple. At that moment, the thug tore the shirt off his body because it was all in blood. At that moment, the informant saw that the thug's entire body was covered in tattoos. Now everything became clear to him. The tattoo he had on his back was not simple. It said that he belonged to a certain group. The informant thought that this thug was from the triad. Then he remembered that the guys who came to him and those who entered into battle with the young man, they also said that they were from the triad. The informant thought that this was a completely different case. If he was not a Hong Kong triad, then who was he? At that moment, it dawned on the informant, and he thought with horror, but he wanted to, that this could not really be. The young man stood opposite this thug, who introduced himself as a gentleman for some time, and it was clear that their showdown was continuing. The young man seemed to be worn out and had no strength at all and was about to fall. The gentleman standing opposite said that he was still very young and was unable to understand that he had fallen into a trap and joyfully rushed into his arms. To which the young man replied that his carcass looked very appetizing for his knife, and he would not miss this spectacle under any circumstances, after which he took off his glasses, which were broken, and threw them on the ground. He didn't need them anymore, so the glasses fell and broke even more. He didn't want to open his eyes. The very next moment, the young man took a step forward and began a new attack against the thug who stood in front of him. The thug tried to grab him, but he couldn't because the young man attacked him very quickly from both sides. And then he went back and was already behind this gentleman. The bully looked at his shoulder and saw that he had another wound from which blood was flowing. He looked at the guy and said that he was using his rat tricks again, after which he turned his head towards the young man and said that he thought it was time for them to wrap things up. The informant, observing everything that was happening, saw that at that moment, the young man had 2 knives. The gentleman looked at his hand and saw that it was badly hurt. He understood that it was too early, too deep, and he could lose a lot of blood if he didn't stop it now. The young man looked at his opponent and said if he wanted to wrap it up, he could help him with that. He stood in anticipation of what was now serving to attack his opponent, but with even greater force. The young man told his opponent that he was just warming up, so he was not ready to stop it. Even time in another part of China, in the city of Guangzhou, there were events that were the consequences of these events. A cartridge of several cars was driving along the highway. It was driving fast because they needed to get there on time. In one of these cars, a gentleman was riding with a girl, each of them looking in their own direction. The gentleman, without turning his head, said that he had been personally summoned to Hong Kong. He was a little surprised by such an invitation because so much time had passed. He talked about it and wanted her to know that all this happened only because of her. The gentleman said that they managed to get such an important invitation despite everything. He thought it was really cool that the girl was sitting and looking out the window and not answering him at all. The girl, despite the fact that he was addressing him, continued to look out the window as if it didn't concern her at all. She was very beautiful, but she was as inaccessible as her beauty. The gentleman did not stop looking at her and admiring her. At that moment, she turned her head and looked at him. She couldn't contradict him because this guy was her brother. Soroka stood on what looked like his opponent, a thug, holding knives in his 2 hands. He told him that he was just warming up. His opponent, standing opposite and holding his wound, understood that the guy had 2 blades and he could inflict many more wounds on him. The brute looked into the young man's eyes and realized that he was not going to back down and that he was really determined. After which he raised his eyes and looked at the knife that was in his hands and from which blood was flowing and drops of this blood were dripping onto the floor. The young man took a step forward and swung his arm to strike his opponent. He was about to attack. His opponent also stood up because he understood perfectly well that this young man would now attack. The young man swung and with one knife slashed at his opponent. The thug barely managed to move his body to the side, after which the young man turned around and swung his second knife to try to hit his opponent again. Despite the fact that each blow was another wound on the enemy's body, it splashed in all directions. The brute only had time to turn his head and see that another early appeared on his body. After the young man attacked, the thug was able to push him back. At that moment, the thug felt a very strong pain. He even clenched his teeth to endure this pain. The young man did not stop. He pushed off to deliver another blow to his opponent. This time, he wanted to put a knife under his throat so that he could get the information he wanted from him. The informant continued to stand at the entrance to this bar near the door to observe everything that was happening. It seemed that no one could surprise him with anything anymore, but this guy surprised him. His main weapon was a double blade, and he can very skillfully handle this weapon against an opponent who settles with his strength. The young man finished one attack and started a new one. During each attack, he dealt 1 damage to his opponent. As a result of one attack, he was able to dodge his opponent's blow and inflict a wound on him by stabbing him right in the stomach. The informant, watching them, understood that the double blades with their abnormally powerful attacks were certainly effective. Also, a real irritant when using two-handed weapons was that it gave a person an advantage in endurance, allowing him to make 2 attacks at once from different sides. The thug, after each of these attacks, videoed that on his case more and more urines and his body is bleeding more and more. He looked at the young man and understood that he would not calm down and would not stop until he achieved his goal. It was clear that the longer the confrontation lasted, the more noticeable the gap between them would be felt. The bully clenched his teeth with all his might to hide how much pain he was in. Despite all the wounds that were on his body, he still tried to swing and strike his opponent. The young man looked at him and said that his opponent's self-confidence was based only on his large size and nothing else. The informant looked at this fight and realized that the young man's blades were not so heavy. Well, nevertheless, he handled them as if they were part of his limbs, and it seemed that they were an extension of him. In other words, one could say that his skill level was on a completely different level. After one attack, the young man carried out another attack and also inflicted damage on his opponent from both sides. Despite all this, the thug was not going to give up. He held on with all his might and tried to fight back the young man and inflict damage on him as well. Soroka, having finished one attack, took a step forward and began the next one. He swung to hit his opponent. The thug managed to turn away, and the blow was tangential. Despite his injuries, the thug tried to control the situation. When the young man's knife was very close to his body, the thug grabbed it by the blade and held it in his hand. The informant understood that this young man had powerful skills, and that he was here for a reason. The young man, despite his opponent holding onto Livy's knife, yanked his knife with all his might to pull it back out of his opponent's fist. But the thug at that moment gathered his strength and pulled the blade so that it fell out of the young man's hands. The young man really couldn't hold the blade and let go of his hand, leaving the blade in the hands of the thug. But because he jerked the bully with great force, he staggered and began to fall backwards. The young man did not stop and swung to hit him again with his fist on the lower part of the jaw. The thug was unable to avoid this blow. The young man knew he couldn't stop, so he pushed off with the strength he had in order to attack his opponent again. The young man jumped up and kicked his opponent right in the jaw. The thug couldn't stay on his feet this time and fell backwards. After just a few minutes, the young man was lying on the ground. He was barely breathing. It seemed like this was the end. He fell to the ground with such a crash that it could only be compared to the fall of a huge stone. The young man immediately approached his opponent. He needed an answer to his question. The informant understood that the young man was, moreover, physically strong and talented in handling clicks. Soroka stood over the body of his opponent. It seemed that this was a complete victory, and he was about to solve his problem. The thug was lying on the ground. He really couldn't get up from the number of frames he had inflicted. The young man looked at him and said that he was an ordinary pig that was lying down in the middle of the sidewalk. The bully could still see, so he turned his gaze to the young man. He saw a young man sitting opposite him, holding a dagger in one hand. Soroka brought this dagger right to his neck. The thug said nothing. He was thinking about what to do. The young man looked at him and said that now, after this fight, it was time for them to talk. He wanted to know how this gentleman knew his younger sister and why he spoke about her like that. The thug, lying on the ground without turning his head, said that it was just funny, after which he began to cough. The magpie demanded that he tell her immediately, otherwise he threatened to make shashlik out of him. At that moment, an informant approached the young man and the thug lying on the ground. He said that it seemed to him that these people were from the triad of the continent. The young man turned his head and asked again what he had just said because it was indeed a serious assumption. The young man thought that this could be so because these people were not random passers-by. For a few minutes, there was silence all around. No one could say anything because they didn't know what to do next. The informant asked the thug lying on the ground if his guess was correct. The bully tried to answer him something but stopped and thought that it was not worth doing. In fact, he certainly didn't think that the end would come for him at that moment, but things took a completely different turn. The young man saw a smile on the thug's face. He asked him again if he was laughing at them and brought a knife to his throat. The thug lying on the ground thought that he was of course very sorry, but most likely that was the end of his steering wheel. He grabbed the knife in the young man's hand with his last strength. Then he pulled the young man's hand so as to deliver the final blow to himself. Soroka couldn't imagine that it would be like this. That's why he couldn't resist him. He didn't want that at all. Soroka knelt down and stood before the body of his opponent. He understood that the end had come for his opponent. The young man understood how he did it, but he could not verify that he had not received any information at that moment. He thought that this pig-like bastard lying on the floor did it on purpose. He was no longer of any use because the young man's dagger was sticking out of his neck, and this thug was making strange last sounds. Now it was all over for sure. The thug was lying on the ground, the young man was sitting next to him, and the informant was standing and looking at this whole picture. The young man did not understand how this happened, because he only needed information and not such a number of victims. The informant also couldn't have imagined when he told this guy a favor for a favor that everything would happen exactly like this. After which Format turned around and stood with his back to the young man, and Soroka continued to sit on the ground and swear that he hadn't succeeded. After which the informant took a few steps forward and said that judging by how everything had gone very far, then his little sister is very closely connected with the creatures and the triads. At that moment he lifted the suit of this gentleman to get her photo. When he took out the photograph that was in the side pocket of his jacket, he also took out his phone. The informant said that he did not think that he would get so much information in just one day. The young man did not understand what he was talking about. He stopped and looked at the informant, who was holding a phone in his hand. He answered him that the chance that she was alive was getting higher and higher. The informant then said that he was going to study the information he had received and suggested that the young man go to a sauna. After which the informant said that they would have trouble if he did not immediately restore order here. At that moment they heard someone's voice, which was coming from very close, but they turned their heads. And they saw that same girl who was with the young man. She was sitting on the threshold of this bar and covering her mouth in fear. The young man thought that most likely the informant was right, and he should go to the sauna. Soroka turned around and started to leave. The informant told him that he would contact him himself, and that he shouldn't even worry. The young man stood there for a few more seconds, looked around, decided that he really had nothing to do here, turned around and left. The informant looked after him for a while, thinking about who this guy really was. Lowering his head, the informant saw many bloodstains and thought that they needed to be removed immediately. Then he picked up the photo and looked again at the killer's sister, after which he said that this photograph should remain with him and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. At the same time, in the headquarters of the Hong Kong Triad, the head of this squad was having a discussion with his successor. His son was unhappy that his father had invited them to Hong Kong. He did not understand what he was thinking, to which the head said that he was ready to figure it out on his own and that his son shouldn't worry. His successor came closer to him and began to demand an explanation. He wanted to know how he was going to do this and whether he really wanted to kill them. He has no reason not to do this, so his successor should not worry about this issue. His son wanted to say something else to his father, but he raised his hand and said that it was enough. He didn't want to talk about this topic anymore. And then he added that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and he didn't want to discuss this topic anymore. At that moment, they both heard a knock on the door. The receiver turned his head and asked who was there. The current head of the triad said that everything is fine. This is the keeper of secrets. The successor asked if he's really under his control. The man who stood behind that door said that he would come again when the current leader was alone. The current head said that everything is fine, and he can enter because he has a person with him who is his successor. The current head of the zoo teapot and ordered the man to enter this room since he has no secrets from his successor. The man who was standing behind the door agreed, and he was ready to enter this room. The successor of the current head of the triad looked at the door without taking his eyes off. The door of this room opened, and in front of them stood a man. His face was not visible because he was in the dark, and also because his head was lowered, and he was thus greeting the current head of the triad. This man, without raising his head, said that he was the keeper of Zhuo Wuxing's secrets. So he greeted the current head of the squad, and he said that he was glad to meet the boss. It was the same informant. This son, a little delayed, the keeper of secrets, stood for some time without raising his head. I greet, and the successor of the current head did not take his eyes off him. On the contrary, the current head of the squad was absolutely calm. He ate, took his cup, and took a few sips from it. The keeper of secrets also took a few steps forward at this time and approached the table at which the current head of the triad was sitting. The keeper of secrets got down on one knee and lowered his head down, He was waiting for permission from the current head of the triad. The successor looked at his father without taking his eyes off him. He decided that he could already sit down in his place. The keeper of secrets, without raising his head, tried to report that he had arrived to report about what the current head of the triad had asked him to check earlier. The head put his cup that he was drinking on the table and remarked that he was afraid that this would not be very good news. The keeper of secrets said that this news will be about Chief Liu Kai. The receiver asked again what Lo Liu Kai means. Then he couldn't hold back and shouted at his father that all this could mean he wanted some kind of explanation from his father. The keeper of secrets did not raise his head. He watched everything that was happening. The current head of the triad told his son to calm down and let the keeper of secrets explain everything. The keeper of secrets continued to kneel, holding his hand in front of him in a way that showed his respect. After he was allowed to speak, he began to explain that in recent months they had identified people in Hong Kong who were engaged in illegal activities. The triad leader's successor asked what prohibited activity meant. He did not understand what was being discussed. The keeper of secrets went on to say that given their official connections, the triad banned things like human trafficking and drug distribution. The receiver turned his head and looked towards his father. He didn't ask any more questions. Then the keeper of secrets said that, on the orders of the head of the dragon, they tracked down their patrons, and as it turned out, it was not an external force but another branch of the triad outside of Hong Kong. This news really angered the successor of the triad leader. He asked again what it could mean. He turned and asked the keeper of secrets whether it should be Guangzhou or Liu Kai. The keeper of secrets did not raise his head. He said that it was not confirmed yet, so he could not say for sure who it was. But the head dragon suspected that this was exactly it. The successor looked at his father and demanded some explanation from him about what all this could mean. His father reached for a cup of tea and told his son that it was just a suspicion, but he knew that Liu Kai had always wanted to expand her scope of activities in this direction. The keeper of secrets continued to stand on one kai with his head down, continuing to show his respect to the Lord. The current head of the squad asked the keeper of secrets what the latest news was. What else could he tell? His assistant, the keeper of secrets, was afraid to even raise his head at that moment. After thinking for a bit, he said to keep an eye on Chief Liu Kai, who might be engaged in some kind of activity. They sent their people to the Guangzhou branch to keep abreast of all developments and report on his every move. But after 1 month, they lost all contact with this man. Most likely, he was discovered. And now, under these conditions, they even lost their last agent. He recently went silent and stopped communicating. After some time, the informant, despite the rain, was in another part of the city and looked around before going inside. After which he went to the window of this establishment. He needed to get information in this particular place. When he knocked, he expected that someone would answer him and he would be able to get information as they had agreed. A man looked out the window and saw him. He opened the window of his cigarette shop. Then the informant gave him a pack of money, and in return he received an open pack of cigarettes. The secret keeper said that in the last message they received, his agents reported. The Chief Liu Kai secretly trains assassins, after which no more messages came from them. And the most important thing in this note was that several months ago, hired killers arrived in Hong Kong. The successor of the current head of the triad was very surprised that the killer arrived in Hong Kong. He did not understand how this could be. The keeper of secrets said that everything is exactly like that, and most importantly, he added that there are only 9 of these hired killers. And these hired killers, they were known by the codename 9 Dragons. Each of them was some kind of dragon. The current head of the triad was very upset. He asked the keeper if he was sure of the information he had just told them. The keeper of secrets responded to the current head of the triad that today they confirmed their presence. The head of the triad put the cup on the table. He was very surprised that they came up with 9 dragons. And the biggest thing that surprised him was that these 9 dragons had already penetrated Hong Kong. He was very interested in all of this. The receiver shouted to his father that this Liu Kai is just a bastard, and this is most likely a rebellion against them. The head of the triad was not so upset. He did not let go of the cup of tea from his hands. He said that most likely this is not a rebellion yet. His successor did not understand what he was saying and what he meant, because he had to immediately call him and interrogate him. The leader of the squad said that his son is only looking 1 step ahead, striving to become the head of the dragon. The successor lowered his head because he was not entirely pleased to hear his father's words, since he sincerely cared about this. The head of the triad said that snakes are the stupidest creatures who think that they can become dragons because they look like them. And then he added that if civil strife begins immediately after he becomes the head of the dragon, the other snakes will bare their fangs one after another. Then the head of the triad turned his head and said that as long as he sat in that place, this would never happen. Then he looked at his son and asked if he knew why he said that. After which the head of the squad approached his son and put his hand on his shoulder. And then he just said it would only happen because he pulled out their fangs before they could show them. And then he added that snakes without fangs are not snakes at all, and they are not as dangerous as they think. The head of the triad looked at his son and asked him if he understood what he was talking about now. No matter how unpleasant it was for his son, and he even lowered his head at that moment, he admitted that he understood everything, and he agreed with the head of the dragon. The leader of the squad said that if they openly enter into conflict with Guangzhou, it will not lead to anything good. And other branches will begin to question Hong Kong's authority, making it twice as difficult for them to manage. Then the head of 3DY said that is why before the turn of inheritance comes, it is necessary to find a nest. He ordered to find the nest where these snakes are hiding. The keeper of secrets bowed and said that he understood everything. The heir to the head of the triad was simply that he considered Liu Kai a bastard and could not even imagine that he could do such a thing. The keeper of secrets, just as he entered this office, he also left it without raising his face. When he left this office, his thoughts were only about one thing, about the young man he had just met. He reached into his inside pocket to get a photo of his sister that the young man was looking for. He looked at the photo of this girl and knew perfectly well that her name was Bai Long. Now he just had to decide if her brother could be one of the 9 dragons. For him, that was the question. After which he put the photo back into his inside jacket pocket. He thought that it was not yet certain. He decided that for now it was better for him to keep this guy a secret and not report him to anyone. The informant stood at the place where they had agreed to meet the young man and was waiting for him. After a while, he saw that the same guy he had met earlier that day was approaching him. The informant looked at the young man and greeted him, but the guy looked at him very suspiciously. The informant tried to somehow distract the young man and find out the information he needed. They decided they needed to go one more place and they went to Victoria Peak. It was always quite a crowded place, and here, unlike the previous place, people came to have fun during the day. Here, from yesterday's place, ordinary guys in love with their girlfriends were walking in reverse. And there were also a lot of people who were small children. It was an absolutely safe place. When the young man heard this whole story from the informant, he was a little surprised that there were 9 dragons. The informant told him that this is exactly how it is, and that they are called dragons despite the fact that they are just hired killers. And the most important thing is that it looks like the mainland triad is supporting these hired killers. The young man asked again if the mainland triad could really do something like that. The informant continued to tell the young man that if Hong Kong is the headquarters of the TRI, then the branches scattered around it are something like outposts. The informant says that the triad branches on the continents, even if they are just branches, act more like separate factions, creating tension with the headquarters. The young man asked the informant again if this was simply a struggle for power, to which he was told that it most likely looked like a struggle for power. Then he continued that in any case the key point is that they are supported by the mainland and not Hong Kong. The young man then said, does he really mean to say that these 9 dragons kidnapped his sister? The informant reached for his glass, which was on the table, turned the straw and said that it was not certain, but he could assume that it was so. The informant said that his sister was definitely connected to those 9 dragons. The young man, without thinking twice, answered the informant that this meant that they had no choice but to pursue these 9 dragons he had spoken of. The drink he was drinking ran out and he sat in silence for a while. The informant noticed that the young man was very nervous, so he decided to change and give him his drink and take the empty glass away. He said that the young man understood everything correctly. Soroka took a glass full of drink and started drinking it. He wanted to get as much information as possible about his sister, so he listened carefully to everything. The informant took out the phone that he had taken from the thug and said that there was only one number saved on the phone. The young man listened to his every word and did not understand why only one phone number was saved. The informant continued to say that this saved number was under the name Dragon, and then he added that it looks like they use it to communicate with him. The young man looked closely at his interlocutor. He wanted to understand what they should do next. The informant said that they needed to meet with this dragon who was registered under this number, and he had already arranged this meeting. The informant raised his head, looked at the young man, and said that this dragon should arrive soon. The informant said that most likely he has not arrived yet and is not here yet. Then he turned his head and looked at the newly arrived carriage. The informant said that he was most likely there. The young man looked carefully at all the people who were in that direction, and one of them seemed to him to really look like a dragon, just like the informant described. It was a well-built young man, physically fit, who was climbing up the steps. This guy thought it was not a good idea to drag him to the top of Hong Kong. The informant, when he saw this guy, he said that it looks like this dragon is already here. The young man turned his head and looked at him. This dragon adjusted his hair. He understood what was being discussed and with whom he had an appointment here. It was an azure dragon. His name was Zhao Kang, and he was one of the 9 dragons. He thought that it looked like he wouldn't need a warm-up. The azure dragon rose and looked around. He tried to figure out who invited him here. He was very different from all the other visitors to this place. It seemed that he was very confident in himself. At some point when he was in the middle of this area, he screamed very loudly. The others who were nearby covered their ears from this scream. The magpie and the informant, hearing this cry, turned their heads and looked at what was happening. Soroka asked the informant if this was the same demonic dragon they were here for. The informant said most likely that no, he would not have come in person, and even if it had been impossible to check whether he was real or not. The informant added that at the moment it is not important for them whether it is a demonic dragon or someone else. After which the informant noticed that he took off his glasses and began to wipe them. It seemed that he was thinking about something. Then he added that at the moment the most important thing is who will be in league with this demonic dragon. Soroka listened to the informant to the end and wanted to know what he was proposing to do at the moment. To do this, he took the glasses, looked at his reflection in them and asked what they would do now. After which, the young man put the glasses on his eyes and looked at his interlocutor. He understood that the informant most likely had a plan, and in fact, that was the case. The informant began to talk about how on Victoria Peak, where they were, there is one of the highest observation platforms in Hong Kong. That is why every year many tourists come here to get to this observation deck. Some of these tourists take a tram to get to this observation deck and ride in it. Others, on the contrary, want to see everything with their own eyes and they climb up the path on foot. On the way back, everything happens the same as on the way up. There are only 2 ways down, he showed his 2 fingers. Soroka told him that in that case, they had no choice but to travel along a certain route together with a huge number of unidentified persons. The informant added that this is the best option for persecution. Soroka did not understand the point of their stay then, he asked the informant, because he had actually agreed on a meeting. They watched the guy who was an azure dragon and did not understand why he continued to wait standing near the clock. This guy was leaning against a pole, and it seemed like he had arrived to meet someone. Then the informant said that they were also continuing to wait, while he leaned back in his chair and looked up. Soroka looked at the informant and didn't understand what he meant. He asked him, to which he was told that he should understand what a snake can do if it fails in its hunt. These words of the informant were even more incomprehensible to Soroka. He looked at his partner in surprise. Then the informant added that the snake will not return to its hole when its efforts are in vain. He turned his head, looked at the young man, and said that they could follow this snake very quietly. And when this snake starts crawling back into its hole, they will be able to find it, and that was his plan. The azure dragon stood near the pillar, waiting for someone to come to meet him. Time passed, and there was no one. The azure dragon closed his eyes and began to remember the recent events and why he was here. When all those who were called dragons gathered at their headquarters, they very rarely gathered for such meetings. Near the wall stood a young man. His head was bandaged and on his face was a huge scar. It was a red dragon, one of the 9 dragons. He was the first to speak. He was interested in what this meeting of the 9 dragons was about. The girl who was smoking a cigarette answered him and said that it was all because of that. That Ryukai will arrive Hong Kong very soon. It was a lecherous dragon, one of the 9 dragons. The black dragon, who was also one of the 9 dragons, joined the conversation and said that, by the way, he does not see the azure and blue dragons. The demonic dragon, the leader of the 9 dragons, standing near the huge window with his back to them, said nothing at first. Then he turned his head, looked at the others and said that the blue dragon had died. The lecherous dragon was very surprised and even a little scared. Was the blue dragon really dead? The red dragon folded his hands in front of him. He stood tense. He also wanted to know the answer. What happened? The black dragon turned his head and asked the leader who killed him. This was the only question they wanted to ask and get an answer to now. The leader, without turning to face him, replied that it is still unknown, but one thing is clear. This man is looking for the white dragon's past identity. The black dragon was even more surprised. He didn't understand why this man needed the white dragon's past. The slutty dragon added that what about the time when she was an unfortunate child sold into slavery? Does he really want to know that? Why would he look for something like that? The leader replied that he doesn't know, but while he's in the process of searching, he doesn't interfere with their plan. At this point, the red dragon interrupted him and said that the main question is whether it is a base or not. The leader continued to talk about how this man had offered to meet them, The dissolute dragon noticed that they were just scumbags. The leader noted that they just need to check whether it really is a base or not. At that moment, the Azure Dragon entered the room and said that he was ready to go. He was sure that he could do it, so he asked the leader if he would be against it. He was interested in what his face was like. He couldn't refuse. The leader thought for a moment, stood and looked at the night city through the huge window in this room. Then he took a step back and turned to address everyone gathered in the room. He told the Azure Dragon that if he understood what this base was, he should hand it over to him, and handed him the item that he should hand over. The Azure Dragon took this item and understood that it would be part of his operation. The leader turned again and began to look out the window, after which he added, "If this is not the headquarters," he said unequivocally that in that case he should kill him. The Azure Dragon stood in the place where they had agreed. He clearly remembered his task and what he had to do. Opening his eyes, he looked at the watch he had on his hand, and he realized that the person who had made the agreement with him was late. The Azure Dragon thought that when he met him, he would either have to kill this guy he met or help him. It was quite a difficult choice, so he couldn't make a mistake under any circumstances. He had to do it. But no one came to this meeting. The Azure Dragon thought about how he had agreed to this meeting and nothing happened. He didn't have time to wait anymore, so he turned around and started to leave this place. He understood that no one would come. At this point, the informant and Soroka realized that they would now need to follow this guy who was supposed to bring them to their hole. The informant handed the young man a radio and told him to take it. Then he added that they should split up and go after this guy so that it would be as unnoticeable as possible. Soroka inserted a radio into his ear in order to stay in touch with the informant so that they could understand where they were without crossing paths. After which the informant told the young man to remember one thing. The goal of their surveillance was not to kill this guy, but to follow him to the very end. Soroka was a little unhappy about being commanded. He said that he already understood everything, and he didn't need to repeat it. The informant had no choice but to trust that the young man would not do anything extra. When they got up from their table, each of them went in different directions, opposite each other. One headed towards the tram, and the other towards the descent. When Magpie approached the queue, he saw that the Azure Dragon was standing and waiting to get on the tram. The guy thought that if he was going to eat the tram, he would also ride it. The Magpie decided that he needed to stand behind the Azure Dragon a few people away and ride with him in the same tram. He reported all this to the informant so that no one else could hear it. The informant in turn was in a completely different part. They needed to introduce me as noticeably as possible. So the informant told him over the radio to blend in with the crowd and follow the Azure Dragon like a current of water. He did this. He held the Azure Dragon in front of him and followed it. When the Azure Dragon got on the tram, he seemed to sense something. He turned his head and looked at those standing behind him. He needed a few seconds to look at everyone who was standing behind him. He did it unnoticed. After which he entered the tram. It seemed that everything was going according to plan, and no one was discovered. Oh, that same tram came in after a few people and Soroka. The most important thing was that he didn't lose the guy he was following. Entering the tram, he thought that he should sit somewhere near the Azure Dragon so as not to make it out of sight. So he came very close and decided that he needed to sit next to him. At that moment, he heard on the radio that an informant was calling him. The young man stopped. Then he turned his head back sharply and looked at the informant, who nodded his head at him. At that moment, the doors of the tram were closed, and the tram suddenly moved off. The tram was driving along the necklace. The informant told the young man that while he was sitting in this tram, he should not look at this guy. The tram was moving very fast and passed one district after another. There were high-rise buildings outside the windows. The Azure Dragon sat by the window in this tram and watched the view in front of him. He acted on the principle that if he sat down in a seat, he should observe the landscape. At the end of this tram, there was an informant. He watched everything that was happening from afar. The informant was very experienced, so he assessed all the people who were in this tram. He found two men wearing raincoats and hats suspicious. The trip time came to an end. The tram started moving very abruptly and also braked. Since this was the final stop, all passengers had to leave this tram. The two in the hats went to the exit. Soroka tried not to miss the Azure Dragon. He stood and waited for him to start coming out. After the Azure Dragon headed towards the exit through several people, and Soroka also headed after him. The informant was watching the two men who were wearing raincoats and hats. They seemed very suspicious to him and looked like spies who were watching someone. The collars of the cloaks of these two men were raised high so that their faces were not visible, and they also put on glasses so that it would be impossible to see them in any way. They were definitely people who were watching someone. The informant couldn't understand who they were and why they appeared on this tram. He thought that he needed to find out who they were. He had no choice but to follow these two in order to understand why they were here. And what other dung flies were mixed up in this matter. He couldn't just leave them like that. Therefore, the informant told the young man not to look back and to listen to him carefully. And the informant himself followed these two disguised men who were ahead of him. The informant told the young man that two more people had stuck to him from behind and were following him. Soroka wanted to clarify only one thing. Were these two who followed him because of the Azure Dragon or because of them? The informant said that he doesn't know yet and they should continue to follow the Azure Dragon. After which the informant added that he would have to walk behind to observe everything that was happening. Soroka understood everything. He followed the Azure Dragon, realizing that two more were following him. At that moment, one of those walking in front of him suddenly hit him in the shoulder. Soroka was distracted and looked at this guy. After which he looked around and saw that the Azure Dragon he was following was gone. He didn't understand how this happened, but the guy he was walking behind in front of him wasn't there. It was unclear where he had gone. He cursed loudly and rushed forward in the hope that he would be able to find him in the crowd. "You without to the station." He looked first in one direction, then in the other direction. What was his surprise when he saw no one? There were a lot of people at that station, but there was no one there who was the guy he was following. Whose voice was that from behind? Asked Soroka if it was really him. The guy didn't understand who it was. Soroka turned sharply in the other direction to look at his interlocutor. In front of him at this station stood an Azure Dragon. The only question he asked him was, did he kill the blue dragon? The Azure Dragon came closer to the young man. He was interested in only one question. Did he kill the blue dragon? The Azure Dragon looked down at the guy. I don't understand if he is so strong that he could kill the blue dragon. He looked at him and said that his behavior gave him away because he was not from Hong Kong and he was very different from everyone else. Soroka thought that he had given himself away. Had he really behaved in such a way that he stood out? The Azure Dragon looked at him and wondered if he was a Korean Chinese or just a Korean. The young man answered him that it didn't matter. Then the Azure Dragon told him that you have very expensive land in the area, so there's not much of a cemetery. After which the Azure Dragon added that this was precisely the reason why he would not like to provide him with a special delivery service. That's why the Azure Dragon wanted to know, because he would need to send his body back to where he came from. These words really hurt Soroka. The muscles on his face started to move, but he tried with all his might to restrain himself. And he clearly remembered the words that the informant told him, that he must remember one thing. The goal of surveillance is not to kill this guy, but to follow him to the very end. At that moment, the young man realized that this was all complete nonsense and that the tracking was also complete nonsense. He couldn't hold back such an insult, and the first thing he did was take out the dagger that he had hidden behind his jacket. Soroka got ready. He was already ready to attack the enemy who stood in front of him. The Azure Dragon was very calm. At this, the Azure Dragon turned its head and looked back. He saw that behind his back, two more of those same ones who were in raincoats and hats were approaching him. The Azure Dragon, seeing these people, asked the guy if he was not alone and looked at the two approaching. After which the Azure Dragon slightly adjusted his hair and said that he was very disappointed. He had a better opinion of this guy. After which the Azure Dragon instantly took off and began to run away so that the young man did not even have time to react. When Soroka turned his head to look after the fleeing Azure Dragon, he was already quite far away. Soroka continued to stand and watch what was happening. He did not know whether he should pursue him. He turned his head and saw those same two guys in hats who were running towards them. Soroka understands that this is not a very good situation and he did not like it. And most importantly, he did not know what to do. Turning around, he followed the Azure Law. This was his goal, so he should not miss it. Two people who looked like spies were running after them and trying not to miss them, while an informant was running behind them. The two in the hats, when they saw that the Azure Dragon was running away and a guy was chasing him, they stopped. Then they turned and looked at each other and punched each other. One of these guys in the hat said that they should split up, and they very quickly split up and started moving forward. A chase was formed. The Azure Dragon was running ahead of everyone. Soroka was pursuing him. Two men in hats were following them, and the informant was watching all this. He ran last and did it very quietly so as not to give himself away. When they all sped up in front, the informant also started moving faster. He didn't need to miss them all. That's why he even started pushing people who were in his way and standing in his way. When he ran up to the distance to continue observing everyone, he stopped. Seeing movement ahead, he wanted to know what the hell was going on. He decided he needed to get closer too, and he pushed the girl away. This girl stopped and looked at the informant. She was here for a reason. She also watched everything that was happening from the side. It was the dissolute dragon who was carrying out her task. Everything that happened looked rather strange. The azure dragon was the first to run away. Soroka was chasing him. Two men in hats were running after them, and the informant was finishing the chase. Having run out into the street, they continued to run in the same order along one of the streets. The informant didn't understand, since he was the last one running, what was going on and why there were so many of them. Soroka also didn't understand what was going on. He pursued the azure dragon with all his might. The azure dragon looked again at how many people were chasing him, and he found it very suspicious. When Soroka was running, he was only thinking about the fact that this guy, the azure dragon, asked him if he had killed the blue dragon. At that moment, the azure dragon turned over the box of bottles with his hand. Right in front of the young man, several boxes filled with glass bottles fell and they rained down on him. The informant thought that this guy was just a scoundrel. He was doing everything to have fun. When the informant heard from Soroka that the azure dragon wanted to know about the blue dragon, he realized that it was most likely that same guy. Soroka portion said that with surveillance, everything failed. Now he wanted to know the plan further. The informant said that they have no choice, they need to catch him. Magpie without Jazz Azure Dragon, now he had to catch it, that was their plan. The Azure Dragon ran up to the descent of the long staircase that led down. He thought that he would be able to break away from them. He looked back and saw a guy running after him and two more chasing them. So the Azure Dragon, unexpectedly for everyone, jumped up so that he could go down the railing. After which he very quickly began to slide down at such a speed that it was unbearable to catch up with him. Soroka stood at the top and watched as the Azure Dragon in an instant found himself at the very bottom. Therefore, the young man had no choice but to repeat what the Azure Dragon had done. He accelerated and jumped up, after which he also found himself on the railing of this descent and began to descend at high speed. The very next moment he jumped because he was practically next to the Azure Dragon at the bottom of this descent. The Azure Dragon turned his head and looked at the young man. He was even a little surprised. He turned around and told him that he was pretty good if he could repeat that trick after him. Soroka did not enter into a discussion with him. He told him to shut up. After which the young man said that the game of tag was over and took out his dagger. Despite the fact that he was already ready to attack his opponent, their attention was distracted and they turned their heads to see who it was. These were the same two in hats who were ready to attack them. They also went down and were already below. The Azure Dragon did not understand who these two were, but he had noticed them long ago and thought that they were helping the young man. Soroka, on the contrary, thought that these two were supporting the Azure Dragon and they were following him to ensure him. When these two went down, they attacked the guys who were below, that is the Azure Dragon and Soroka. Having repelled their first attack, the two stood in front of them, ready to attack again. The Azure Dragon asked the young man why they were not on the same side. Then Soroka answered him that he wanted to ask him the same question. These two stood opposite each other, holding huge knives in their hands, and it was unclear what they were going to do next. The tension between them grew. It was unclear who was whose enemy, who was spying on whom, and who was going to eliminate whom. At that moment, the informant shouted. He was the last one who participated in this chase. He ran up the stairs. The Azure Dragon took a deep breath and said that it was a complete mess, and it was unclear who was who. After which he turned around abruptly and started running away again. He thought that it would be best for him to hide. The young man started running after him, since he was given the task of catching the Azure Dragon, and the two in the hats ran after them. The informant who came down and was already standing below thought that this was some kind of curse. All this was a chase. Everything continued at the same pace as before. The Azure Dragon ran first, followed by a young man, and behind the two of them ran two in hats. The Azure Dragon ran to the next staircase that led down and saw that there weren't enough people on it. So he decided that he shouldn't stop. He jumped up, grabbed the railing, and started going down. He needed to push off with his foot to do a somersault and go down without hitting the other people on the stairs. Then he very quickly moved down to find himself at the very bottom. He needed a few seconds to push off, do a flip, and end up at the bottom to break away from the others. Soroka stood at the very top of the staircase and watched as the Azure Dragon was able to descend down. He had no choice but to repeat what the guy who was running away from him had just done. He also jumped up and grabbed the railing with one hand, after which he also ran along the wall, pushing off and doing a somersault. After which he, like his opponent, landed at the very bottom and followed in his footsteps. 40. His opponent to go far, he pursued him practically shaksha and was very close. The two in the hats, when they approached the staircase, they thought about what to do now and what to do next. They looked down as the azure dragon ran away and was pursued by a young man, neither of them giving in to the other. The azure dragon thought that he had already managed to break away, turned his head. He was very surprised because the guy was practically behind him. The two in the hats couldn't repeat this trick after them, so they had no choice but to run down these stairs, pushing people aside. The azure dragon saw that not far in front of him there was a tram that was about to touch down very soon. He decided that he needed to head in that direction. So he jumped up and jumped over the railings. He needed it in order to get to this tram. When Soroka approached, he realized that he would have to do the same thing as that guy. Otherwise, he would lose him. So he ran closer and pushed off in order to also jump over this railing. He repeated the same thing as the azure dragon. It seemed that he was not inferior to him in anything. Well, in fact, he had to jump down from a fairly large height, just like his opponent. The azure dragon managed to stay on his feet, and after landing, he continued to run away, but the young man couldn't hold on and fell to the side. Despite this, he began to get up, as there was no way he could fall behind the azure dragon. When he got up, he needed to understand what the azure dragon would do and where he was heading. In order not to fall behind him, he immediately began to catch up with him. He could not allow him to disappear from his field of vision. The azure dragon was almost at his destination. He only had to run to the tram that was standing in front of him. A young man was chasing him. The two men in hats realized that they couldn't catch up with the two guys. They remained standing at the top. The only thing they had left was to go down the stairs. That was their only chance. The two in the hats ran up to go down the stairs. There were a lot of people, but they had no other choice. They stood at the top and thought about how best to go down and whether they would have time to catch up with those two if they went down. The tram was standing at the stop. The azure dragon was practically next to this tram. A little more and it would have been inside. So he sped up a bit because the tram was starting to leave and he might not have time to get inside. He pushed off and at the last moment jumped into this tram. This was his chance to escape. After which the azure dragon looked around. He thought that the pursuit of him was over. He broke away. Of course, those two in hats couldn't catch up with him anymore. They were very far away. He thought that the young man who was chasing him wouldn't be able to keep up with him either. But at that moment, he heard someone calling him. He was a little surprised because he didn't expect it. The azure dragon saw the young man and said, "Has he really not gone home yet?" Soroka told him that he had enough of this nonsense. He had questions, so they needed to talk. The azure dragon said that he agreed, and that he also needed to make sure of something. However, he really wants to avoid a boring conversation, so he took out his weapon and was ready to engage in combat with the young man. The azure dragon said that this kind of conversation was more to his taste, and he was not going to give him anything. Soroka was prepared for such a turn of events. He laughed and replied that one and the other were the same. Why did none of them understand simple words? The azure dragon looked at the young man and expressed his surprise that he owned knives. Soroka didn't argue with him. He decided that if this guy wants it that way, it will be his way. So he took a step forward to attack his opponent and told him that he was very happy about this meeting. A few minutes ago, when all this chase was going on and when the azure dragon jumped out at the last moment into the departing tram, at this moment Soroka also sped up a bit and managed to jump into this tram at the last moment. He was able to do this only because he made an effort and was able to jump onto the departing trams. When the two guys in hats ran up, the tram had already started moving and they didn't make it in time, and the informant was swearing because he was the last one. Informant Ru, it was hard to keep up with everyone. Beads of sweat were dripping down his face. The two men in hats, when they realized they couldn't make it, they stopped running, they stopped. One of these men told the other that they had missed out, and now they had to decide what to do. The informant didn't think long. He needed to find out who these guys were and why they were following him. He shouted to them, and the two turned and looked at the informant. They were surprised that they were being addressed. The informant looked at them. He was interested in only one question. Who are they, and why are they participating in this chase? One of those two in the hats said that they should be asking questions here and not answering them. When the informant saw their faces, he immediately realized that these were most likely guys from the secret forest organization. The double-decker tram was going along its route. There were practically no people inside it except for the azure dragon and Soroka. These two decided to sort things out. Each of them prepared to attack by taking the first step towards their opponent. Already the next minute, each of these guys hit the enemy's weapon, and not both were quite strong opponents. The azure dragon said that his opponent screwed up with surveillance but skillfully wielded a knife. Soroka was a little surprised that he was given such a compliment about his skill with a knife. At that moment, he threw his opponent a little further so that he could attack. He then pushed off with his foot to strike his opponent. Trying to attack and strike the azure dragon, the young man swung, but his opponent dodged the blow. after which the Azure Dragon suddenly turned towards the young man and began its attack. Azure Law swung and tried to damage his opponent. It turned out that this blow could not be avoided. But what was his surprise when the guy who stood in front of him was able to dodge his blow? And immediately after they tried to hit Soroka, he immediately swung his elbow and hit his opponent. But his opponent was experienced enough and was able to block the young man's blow with his weapon. And the forces were equal, and their abilities were also equal. They were two equal opponents. They tried to damage each other by taking turns attacking first one and then the other. The Azure Dragon noticed that the young man had quite a lot of experience in knife fights. Soroka did not say anything, did not confirm or deny this. He did not want to say anything at all. The Azure Dragon added that his fighting style seemed very rough to him, and he doubted that he was from this continent. At that moment, the young man thought that this Azure Dragon was much stronger than his previous opponent. So he decided that there was no need to listen to him, and there was no need to drag it out for so long. He just needed to push him. At that moment, the Azure Dragon said that he had one feeling, and at that moment, he looked at the guy. The Azure Dragon looked straight into his eyes, expecting the young man to start attacking him. Now he asked if he was by any chance not Russian. These words were really very offensive for Soroka, so he took a step forward and tried to damage his opponent by swinging his dagger. As soon as he swung, his attack was blocked. It seemed like the Azure Dragon was calculating his every move. Soroka was not going to stop after his first punch was blocked. He struck with his second hand. It seemed that the Azure Dragon split into two and managed to block each of his blows, guessing from which side it would be made. Soroka did not stop. He continued to attack. He understood that this enemy was much stronger than the previous one. Unexpectedly for both of them, they heard the voice of a passenger sitting in this tram. This man wanted to know what was going on. At that moment, the driver of this tram said that there would be a sharp left turn now, and all passengers should get ready. After which the tram driver put his hand in the hall and began to turn sharply to the left. The tram really turned very sharply. In order to stay on, you had to hold on to the handrails. But these two weren't going to stop. Even this sharp turn wasn't a hindrance to them. The passenger who had just asked what was going on felt that the tram was turning sharply, and he needed to hold on as tightly as possible. The young man, in order to hold on and not fall during this turn, held his body to the handrail with a knife. His opponent did the same on the other side. He also held his body so as not to fall. The Azure Dragon at this point, since he could not strike with a weapon, he swung and tried to strike with his foot. Soroka did the same thing as his opponent. The Azure Dragon, despite the fact that he dodged his opponent's blow, was also able to dodge the broken seat that was flying around the tram's interior. The Azure Dragon knew that this could not continue for long, so he decided to strike his opponent again, throwing seats at him so that he would distract his attention to it. The young man set up a blog to avoid being hit by a foreign object, and he was distracted by this object. As soon as this object fell, the Azure Dragon tried to kick it with all its might. When Soroka realized that there would be another blow, he continued to stand in the block ready for this blow. Immediately after the Azure Dragon dealt this blow, it jumped back a distance away from the young man. After which the Azure Dragon told Magpie that he thought they had already introduced themselves to each other enough. And raising one hand up, he said that now they should get down to business. Soroka listened carefully to his opponent. He needed to understand what he wanted. The only passenger who was in this carriage was very scared when he saw the weapon. He grabbed his suitcase and sat down near the window. This passenger was very scared that he was riding in this tram. Immediately after these words, he saw that the Azure Dragon began to leave, and the young man began to catch up with him. When Soroka started to climb up to the second floor of this tram following his opponent, he received a kick in the face. The Azure Dragon did not stop this fight. He continued it, trying to strike again. The Azure Dragon pressed the young man against the crossbar and was ready to strike him. But before he struck this blow, the Azure Dragon asked him why he killed the blue dragon here. He then swung his right hand, trying to hit the young man in the chest, and the 40 blocked his blow. The Azure Dragon wanted to know why it was necessary to kill the blue dragon. He saw no point in it and continued to strike the young man. Move back a little, Soroka was in a better position. He needed to reboot. After which he told the Azure Dragon that he did not understand whether they had given each other a childish oath of friendship, because in reality they both live at the bottom in the shadow of this world. Then the young man added that most likely the blue dragon's time had come when it was time for him to die. At this moment, the Azure Dragon struck with all its might and struck the young man, blood spurting out in all directions. But this did not stop the magpie in any way. He swung and struck back at his opponent. This blow of his also reached its target, and his opponent's face was all covered in blood. after which Soroka did not stop and delivered another kick to his opponent's face. At the last moment, the Azure Dragon was able to block this blow by putting his right hand in front of his face. Each of them returned to their original position, and each of them waited for someone else to start attacking first. Soroka said that now it was his turn to ask questions. He asked what they were doing with his little sister. The Azure Dragon didn't understand what was going on and why he was talking about his sister. He was very surprised. Wasn't he looking for the White Dragon? Soroka then added to him that it was she, and she was his younger sister, and he was just a scumbag. After which he became very angry and swung to strike with both hands at once. He shouted that they had taken her away from him. The Azure Dragon did not expect such a turn of events and at the last moment blocked his body to prevent damage. They, as at the beginning of the fight, stood opposite each other, looking at each other and holding each other's daya. The Azure Dragon asked the young man what taken meant and what his sister's name was. At that moment, the magpie said to the Azure Dragon if his memory had really returned when he was almost dead, he very suddenly began to remember. The Azure Dragon said that he lives one life, but it is divided into two. One is at the bottom in the shadow, so he may not know something. Soroka decided that there was most likely some truth in his words, so maybe he really didn't know that it was his sister. After which he called her name. His sister's name was Seo-jin-ah. At that moment, the Azure Dragon's face became very tense. At that moment, the tram they were riding in suddenly began to break. These guys could barely keep themselves on their feet. The tram stopped at the stop, and several people got off the tram. The Azure Dragon looked out the window, namely at the place where they had agreed. He needed to make sure that everything was going according to plan. Raising his head up, he noticed the roof of one of the houses. Then he turned his head and looked at the roof of another house, but he also saw nothing there. He needed to understand whether the lecherous dragon had already taken up position or whether it was not there yet. Then he turned his head and looked at the roof of the next house, and he saw the glittering light. Then he realized that she was there, and if he got off this tram, his opponent would be in the crosshairs. She really had them under her gun and clearly saw everything that was happening inside this tram. When they arrived, she pointed her gun straight at the young man. Now she only had to pull the trigger. The lecherous dragon took a position and aimed straight at the enemy in order to make an accurate shot. Once she had everything set out, all she had to do was pull the trigger and fire that shot. Soroka didn't know yet that he was under fire, so he decided to attack his opponent one more time. The Azure Dragon was a little surprised because he didn't even think that this guy's sister could be called Seo-jin-ah. And most importantly, he understood at that moment that he would be shot now, since the dissolute dragon had already pulled the trigger and fired her shot. The bullet was flying at high speed and should have been in the guy's body in a few seconds. When the bullet flew up to the tram they were in, it first broke the glass and many small fragments fell. The bullet was almost next to his head when the young man noticed that it was very close, and he needed to do something about it. When he started this attack a few minutes ago, the Azure Dragon understood that the death of his opponent was inevitable. He was under the gun, and a shot would be fired now. So when the young man ran closer to him, the Azure Dragon swung one of his legs with all his might to strike his opponent. After which he jumped up and kicked him with all his might so that the magpie flew out of the tram. At that moment, the bullet passed almost next to him. Only thanks to this blow he remained intact. Since the Azure Dragon hit him with all his might, the young man could not stay on his feet and was thrown back. Soroka only managed to group himself and felt himself being thrown back. The next moment he flew out of the tram onto the street. Through the window, the glass fell and he fell to the ground. After doing a somersault in the air, he was able to land on one leg and one knee, tucked in for an attack. Raising his head up, the young man looked around and then forward. He saw that on the second floor of this tram, there was his rival who threw him out of there. The Azure Dragon did not understand what to do. On the one hand, he had to help him, and on the other hand, he had to kill him. At some point, he realized that he had to give back the very thing that was given to him when he met him, and he threw it to the young man. Magpie doesn't understand what it is. He still caught this thing. It should have been an answer to some questions. At that moment, the tram in which he and the Azure Dragon were located suddenly moved off. The Azure Dragon, who was standing on the second floor, waved his hand at him and shouted that this time they were saying goodbye, but he hoped that they would meet soon. Soroka was a little surprised by everything that was happening. He raised his head and looked around. The lecherous dragon continued to remain in her position. She kept them under her gun the whole time. When the tram started moving, she saw that there was no one there. She didn't understand where the young man had gone. Turning her weapon one way, she saw a guy running away. Then she turned the other way. She saw two more guys. Then she turned to look and saw another guy running away. When she got closer, She saw that in his hand was the very object that was supposed to be handed over. She couldn't shoot him because he disappeared around the corner of the house, and she couldn't see him. She sat for a while longer, waiting for him to come out of that very place and for her to be able to pull the trigger again. The young man stood around the corner of the building waiting for her to leave this position. He had no choice but to wait for her to leave in order to survive. He saw that she had collected all her weapons, turned around and began to leave the position. After waiting a little longer and observing the position, he made sure that there was no one there. Only after that did he take a deep breath and thought that now he could calmly leave his shelter. He held in his hand this object that the Azure Dragon gave him. He was very interested in what it was. He thought he should see what this item was and why he handed it over at the end of their battle. When he opened this box, he didn't understand what it was and why he needed it. At the same time, the informant's car was driving at high speed to its destination. The informant was sitting behind the wheel of this car, smoking a cigarette and thinking about what to do next. There were two people sitting in the back seat of his car, the same two people who had taken part in the chase. When the informant took them to an abandoned factory and dropped them off, he wanted to know if they were Liu Wen's people. The informant asked them because he did not understand why they would burn candles at someone else's party. One of the men in the hat, it was the left shadow, replied that Mr. Liu Wen does not want you to inherit even the slightest variable. Then he entered into conversation with the second one. It was the right one. He said that Mr. Liu Wen wanted to deal with the situation of the white dragon on his own. The informant then asked the two if this was a direct order from the dragon head Liu Wen. One of these guys replied that no, this is the wish of the person who is going to become the head of the dragon. Then the informant said that there is such a thing as circumstances, and wouldn't it be better for them to discuss everything in advance? The left shadow responded to the informant that he is not reliable. He created problems and suffered a collapse. And the right shadow added that he has already cited his own freedom many times, major and minor bloodshed in Hong Kong. The informant then said that he had sufficient authority. Sometimes small incidents happen during work, and most likely they crossed the line by secretly monitoring a secret agent who is directly subordinate to the dragon's head. The left shadow lifted his hat and said that in that case, why doesn't he provide a report before saying something like that? The informant looked at him and didn't understand what he was talking about or what he meant. Then the right day adjusted her glasses and said that something was missed about the guy in the sunglasses. He added that his body movement did not resemble an ordinary member of the organization, and they needed to understand who we really are. The informant smiled, raised his hand, and began to explain that there was no need to touch on such things. He simply hired this guy. He was from Russia and a very useful guy. The informant took a step forward and added that everything has become chaotic lately. This is an investment just in case. After which he turned and started to leave. He said if he was done with his business, then he could leave, waved his hand at them, and said that they would see each other again. Then he turned his head, raised his index finger, and said that if they ever crossed paths, they should not pretend to know him. After which he said that he had already explained everything to them and waved his hand at them. The left and right remained standing in place for a day. They had nothing more to say. As soon as the informant stepped forward, they suddenly told him to stop. The informant stopped and turned his head back. He did not understand what else they needed. The right shadow said that his phone rang, and it was Liu Wen, and so that he would pick up the phone and answer him. He handed him the phone. The informant didn't think twice about this phone. He was ready to answer the dragon's head. When he saw who was calling, he thought that this guy had already taken over the duties of the dragon's head. He was very upset that he was not yet the head of the dragon, but had already forced his close associates to watch him. He didn't like this whole situation very much, but he couldn't do anything, so he decided to watch. The two who were following him couldn't even drive a car. They were completely useless. The informant thought that so many events were happening without his knowledge that he couldn't even imagine it. He was well aware that as the date of inheritance approached, he was becoming increasingly impatient. The informant thought that he was becoming very bold to the point of indignation, and that this should be reported to the current head of the dragon. While he was away, he was thinking about what else he should do, and Ryukai was now on their way to Hong Kong. He was also worried about the brothers who, when paired together, could cause a lot of trouble. Something had to be done about it. After some time, a whole delegation consisting of security guards stood at Hong Kong International Airport. The future head of the dragons, behind whom stood the left-right day, and also several more people from the security stood and met at the airport. One of those people who were present at this was the informant. He watched everything and observed. The future head of the dragon was very indignant and said that it was very reckless. If someone wanted to come, they should have said so in advance. The informant tried to catch his every word and every action in order to report to the head of the dragons. The glass doors suddenly opened and two people came out of this airport building. One of them was the great dragon Cao Ren, one of the 9 dragons, and he was really huge. The second one was opposite the small dragon Cao Chen. He was also one of the 9 dragons. The security that met us looked at these 2 dragons and thought, what kind of build is this? One is just huge and the other is very small. The huge one took out an umbrella and pressed a button so that the umbrella would open automatically. Then he picked up this umbrella and held it in front of him. It seemed like he was holding this umbrella for someone. Indeed, he held this umbrella not for himself but for the third person who arrived with them and whom they all met here. As soon as this person made check, he said that they had tried well. It was Liu Wen. He was as always completely confident and behaved defiantly. The little dragon also opened his umbrella and raised it up so that nothing would drip on their master. Liu Wen turned his head and said that he was ready to introduce his sister now. He extended his hand to her. At that moment, you all heard a girl in heels approaching him. Liu Wen then she came closer to him. He told her to go out and greet those who met her. The girl took a step forward. Then she put her hand on her chest. Dad lowered his head in this way, greeting everyone gathered. After she raised her head and they couldn't see her, she had very sad eyes. She was simply beautiful, her long white hair that you couldn't take your eyes off of, and her white skin. The men who came to greet her looked only in her direction. The informant who was among them was also very surprised. He did not understand who she was, but he guessed. He knew it was most likely Ling Jixia, but in reality it was the white dragon Seo Jinna, and she was one of the 9 dragons.